On the 4th of May, 1903, Judge James B. Markham stood on the steps of the Breathitt County Courthouse. He was a man of the law, a symbol of order in a land that had forgotten the meaning of the word. A single shot echoed from a nearby window, sharp and final. The judge staggered back into his own courthouse and fell dead, a public execution designed to send a chilling message. In this corner of Kentucky, the only law that mattered came from the barrel of a gun. This was not an isolated act. It was a declaration of war in a place that had already earned its name, bloody Breathitt. Was this a county of savages, or was it a place where honorable men were locked in a desperate battle for the very soul of the mountains? The truth, as always, is far more complicated and far more terrifying. Today, we trace the story of how power, greed, and an ancient code of honor turned a quiet county into a battlefield. To understand the blood that was spilled, you must first understand the ground that soaked it up. Late 19th century Breathitt County was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of fog-choked hollows and ancient hills that guarded its secrets fiercely. It was a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, not by the clocks of a distant government. The people here were bound to the land and to each other by ties of blood and shared hardship. They were proud, self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of any authority that didn't carry their last name. The deepest scar on the soul of these mountains was the Civil War. Kentucky was a border state, a fractured land where loyalties were a personal and often fatal choice. In Breathitt, neighbor fought neighbor, and in some tragic cases, brother fought brother. When the official war ended, the fighting did not. Men returned home not to peace, but to simmering resentment. They brought their rifles with them, along with the grim knowledge that violence was a swift and effective way to settle a dispute. The old Union and Confederate grudges never truly died. They just became the fault lines for the family wars that would follow. This brutal history reinforced an older, unwritten law, the Code of the Mountains. In this isolated world, family was everything. It was your government, your army, and your only true safety net. An insult delivered to your cousin was an insult delivered to you, and it demanded an answer. Justice wasn't something you waited for a judge in a powdered wig to dispense. It was something you took yourself, often at the end of a path with a rifle in your hands. This wasn't seen as murder, it was seen as balancing the scales. This code was born of necessity. When your nearest neighbor is a mile away and the county seat is a day's hard ride, you learn to solve your own problems. A man's word was his bond, and his honor was his most valuable possession, worth more than his land, his livestock, or even his life. To have it challenged publicly was an unforgivable offense. It was this fierce, uncompromising sense of personal honor that would serve as the trigger for so much of the violence to come. Into this crucible of old wounds and rigid honor, a new element was introduced: progress, or what passed for it. Timber and coal barons from the north began to see the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. The railroad snaked its way into the hollows, bringing with it outside money, slick lawyers, and a lust for the region's vast natural wealth. Suddenly, control of the local courthouse wasn't just about settling local disputes. It was about controlling land deeds, mineral rights, and fortunes beyond imagination. This collision of worlds created the men who would fight the Breathitt County War. They were forged by the Civil War's lingering hatreds, governed by an ancient code of clan loyalty, and now tempted by a wave of new greed. They were men who believed their honor was worth dying for, and who were now being told that their entire world was for sale to the highest bidder. The storm was inevitable. Before the assassinations and the arrival of the state militia, there was a tense, fragile peace in Breathitt County. You have to imagine the town of Jackson in those days, a place of dusty streets and watchful eyes, where the future of the entire region was being decided not in an election booth, but in the quiet conversations held in hotel lobbies and general stores. It was a community living on a powder keg, but for a time, it was still a community. At the center of one world, was Judge James "Jim" Hargis. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a corrupt political boss who ruled with an iron fist. But to his supporters, and there were many, he was the patriarch of Breathitt County. The Hargis Hotel wasn't just a building, it was the capital of an unofficial kingdom. On any given day, you could find Jim Hargis there, holding court. A farmer might come to him to settle a land dispute. A young man might ask for a loan to start a family. Hargis was the law, the bank, and the government all rolled into one. He understood the mountain people because he was one of them. He provided a kind of stability, a predictable order. It was his order, to be sure, but in a chaotic world, that was something. He had built a dynasty of power, and he aimed to protect it and the people who lived under his influence. On the other side stood men like Judge James B. Markham and Ed Callahan. They represented a different vision for the mountains. Markham wasn't a patriarch, he was a lawyer. He believed in the power of books, of precedent, of a justice that was blind and applied equally to all men, regardless of their last name. He saw the Hargis machine as a cancer, a corrupting force that kept Breathitt County trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. He fought his battles in the courtroom, armed with legal briefs and righteous indignation, seeking to dismantle the little Tsar's empire from within. Ed Callahan was the embodiment of that same fight, but he met it on the streets. He was a respected and fearless lawman, a man who believed his badge should mean something. Where Hargis commanded loyalty through favors and fear, Callahan earned respect through raw courage. He was the man who would walk into a saloon to disarm a drunkard when no one else dared, the man who would serve a warrant on a known killer. He and Markham were the face of the Reform Party, and they were fighting for a future where a man's success depended on his merits, not on his allegiance to a political boss. For a while, these two worlds coexisted. The Hargis men would walk on one side of the street, the Callahan men on the other. Business was conducted, families were raised, and life went on under a veneer of civility. But everyone knew the peace was hollow. These were not just two political factions, they were two fundamentally different futures vying for control of the same small patch of earth. One side was fighting to protect the world they had built, the other was fighting to build a new one. Both believed they were in the right. And in the mountains of Kentucky, when two sides both believe they are right, the result is almost always bloodshed. But peace is a fragile thing, and in every great tragedy, there is a crack in the armor of the men who stand at its center. For James Hargis, that flaw was a pride as old and unyielding as the mountains themselves. His control over Breathitt County was not a political office, it was his birthright. He had built his world through sheer force of will, and he could not tolerate the slightest challenge to his authority. To him, opposition was not a difference of opinion. It was a declaration of personal war. This wasn't the hot-headed pride of a young brawler. It was a cold, calculating force. They say that years earlier, a merchant in town had dared to publicly support one of Hargis's political rivals. Hargis didn't send men with guns. He did something far worse. He quietly passed the word. The man's credit was cut off at the bank. His suppliers suddenly had trouble filling his orders. Friends who had known him for 20 years would cross the street to avoid speaking to him. Within a year, the man was bankrupt and broken, forced to leave the county in shame. Jim Hargis didn't just defeat his enemies, he unmade them. This absolute refusal to share or cede power was his great strength, and it would become the engine of the coming war. The fatal flaw of the reformers, of men like Judge Markham and Ed Callahan, was the mirror image of Hargis's pride. It was a rigid, almost naive faith in the power of the law itself. They truly believed that the system, if followed correctly, was strong enough to protect them. They believed that a court order held more power than a Winchester rifle, and that a properly filed indictment could bring down a king. They saw the corruption of the Hargis machine and believed they could dismantle it piece by piece with the tools of their trade: legal arguments, witness testimony, and appeals to a higher authority. When the threats against them began, whispered in the street and delivered in unsigned notes. Their response was to seek injunctions and write letters to the governor in Frankfurt. They trusted in a process that Jim Hargis had spent a lifetime learning how to manipulate and control from the inside. They were honorable men trying to play by the rules in a game where their opponent had already burned the rulebook. This faith in paper and ink, in a world that still answered to lead and steel, would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. And so the stage was set. On one side, a man whose pride would not allow him to bend. On the other, men whose principles would not allow them to break. It was a collision of two opposing kinds of stubbornness, two incompatible definitions of justice. In the suffocating quiet of the Kentucky mountains, there was no longer any room for compromise. A single spark was all that was needed to make the whole valley burn. The spark finally landed in 1902. It wasn't a public argument or a contested election. It was the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle in the dark. The target was James Cockrell, the town marshal of Jackson. But Cockrell was more than just a lawman. He was Jim Hargis's right hand. He was the muscle that backed up the little Tsar's quiet orders, the walking, breathing symbol of the Hargis machine's control over the streets. When Cockrell walked by, people understood who was in charge. His authority flowed directly from the rocking chair in the Hargis Hotel. One evening, he was cut down from ambush. It was a classic feud-style killing, a shot from the shadows, with no warning and no chance to fight back. In the code of the mountains, this was more than murder. It was an act of profound disrespect. It was a message, written in gunpowder and blood, sent directly to Jim Hargis. It said, "Your man is not safe. Your power is not absolute. Your walls can be breached." For a man like Jim Hargis, whose entire world was built on a foundation of unshakable authority, this was the ultimate insult. His pride, the very core of his being, had been publicly challenged in the most brutal way imaginable. This wasn't a legal matter to be sorted out by investigators and juries. This was a personal attack on his house, his name, and his honor. The gears of the official law were too slow, too uncertain. The only justice that mattered now was the swift, terrible justice of the clan. The Hargis faction didn't wait for proof. In their minds, there was only one group with the motive and the audacity to carry out such an act: the Callahan-Markham reformers. The accusation was made instantly and publicly. The word went out through the hollers and across the ridges. The opposition had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They had spilled first blood. That single shot changed everything. It tore away the thin veil of civility that had covered the county's tensions. The conflict was no longer about politics or legal maneuvering. It had become a blood feud. The time for filing motions in court was over. The time for filing coffins had begun. The cycle of vengeance, that terrible grinding engine of mountain warfare, had been switched on. And once it starts, it doesn't stop until it runs out of bodies to consume. In the days that followed James Cockrell's murder, a heavy silence fell over Breathitt County. It was the silence of a held breath, the kind of quiet that comes before a lightning strike. The elders of the community, men who still carried the scars of the Civil War, saw the signs. They had seen this kind of storm gather before. Preachers took to their pulpits, pleading for peace. Respected old men, who owed allegiance to neither faction, went as intermediaries, their hats in their hands, begging for calm and reason. They warned that this was a fire that, once lit, would consume the innocent along with the guilty. These warnings fell on deaf ears. They went to the Hargis Hotel and spoke to the little Tsar himself. Jim Hargis would listen to them patiently, his face a mask of cold granite. He would offer them a drink, thank them for their concern, and then show them the door. In his mind, their pleas for peace were an insult. How could there be peace when his man lay in the ground, struck down from the dark? To compromise now, to let the matter be handled by a slow and corruptible legal system, would be a show of weakness. It would be an admission that his power, his very authority over the county, could be challenged with impunity. His response was not to de-escalate, but to tighten his grip. Known gunmen and loyalists, men like Curtis Jett and Tom White, began to appear more frequently on the streets of Jackson, their presence a silent promise of retribution. On the other side, the same desperate pleas were made to Judge Markham and Ed Callahan. Friends and family begged them to be careful, to leave town for a while and let the situation cool down. A living dog is better than a dead lion, they were told. But their own unbending principles made this impossible. Judge Markham saw it as his sworn duty to uphold the law, especially when it was under attack. To flee would be to surrender the courthouse and the very idea of justice to the forces of intimidation. He believed with every fiber of his being that the shield of the law was strong enough to protect him. Ed Callahan, a lawman to his core, refused to be intimidated. He continued his patrols, served his warrants, and walked the streets of Jackson as if nothing had changed. He rejected the idea of surrounding himself with a heavy guard, arguing that a sheriff who had to hide behind a wall of rifles was no sheriff at all. They put their faith in the system. They wrote letters to the governor detailing the threats. They tried to empanel a grand jury. They fought back not with guns, but with affidavits and legal motions, believing that the truth written on paper would ultimately prevail over the lies whispered in the shadows. Every attempt at peace became just another step towards war. When neutral citizens tried to form a committee for public safety, both sides accused it of being a front for the other. When the governor sent a tepid message urging a peaceful resolution, it was seen as a sign of weakness from the state, emboldening the hardliners. The town of Jackson was no longer a community. It was two armed camps staring at each other across a dusty main street. The path of compromise had vanished, overgrown with pride on one side and principle on the other. Every man in Breathitt County had to choose a side, and everyone knew that the talking was over. The air in Jackson had grown so thick with hate you could taste it. The threats against Judge Markham were no longer whispers. They were shouted in the street. His friends stopped visiting after dark. Notes were left on his doorstep, crude and clear in their meaning. The world was closing in on him, and everyone knew a final terrible line was about to be crossed. This was the moment for one last off-ramp, one final chance to turn back from the abyss. That chance came, as it so often does, in the quiet of his own home. The story goes that on the night before he died, his wife came to him, her face pale with a fear that was beyond tears. She begged him, not as a political figure, but as her husband and the father of her children. "James, let us leave this place," she pleaded. "Let's go somewhere the names Hargis and Callahan mean nothing. What good is the law if it leaves your children without a father?" It was the clearest choice a man could face. His duty on one hand, his life and family on the other. It was a direct plea to the man, not the judge. For a long moment, Markham was silent. He was not a fool. He knew the danger was not just real, it was imminent. He could see the logic in his wife's plea, could picture a life of peace far away from the blood-soaked soil of Breathitt County. He could have packed a bag, taken his family, and been gone by sunrise. No one would have called him a coward. They would have called him a sensible man who chose to live. This was the crossroads. He could choose to be a husband and father, or he could choose to be a symbol. But the judge's faith in the law was as unbending as a rod of iron. He looked at his wife, and with a heavy heart, he made his decision. If a circuit judge can be run out of his own courthouse by threats, he told her, then there is no law in these mountains. There is only the rule of the gun. And if that is the case, then our children have no future here anyway. I will not run. He believed to his very soul that to back down would be to hand a final victory to the forces of anarchy. He had to believe the system he served was worth dying for. In that moment, he consciously rejected the path of peace and fully committed to his tragic course. He sealed his own fate not with anger or pride, but with a quiet, resolute sense of duty. The conversation was over. The last chance for a different outcome had passed. He would go to the courthouse in the morning, as he had every other morning. He would stand on those steps and face whatever came. He had made his choice. The morning of May the 4th, 1903, dawned like any other. The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Jackson. Inside the Breathitt County Courthouse, the air was thick with the familiar smell of old paper and stale tobacco. Judge James B. Markham presided over his cases, his voice calm and steady, a small island of order in an ocean of simmering chaos. When the day's business was done, he walked out onto the front steps, pausing for a moment to speak with a friend, the tension of the courtroom momentarily behind him. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sound, sharp and violent, cracked the afternoon calm. It was not a firecracker. It was a single, deliberate report that echoed off the brick buildings and sent a flock of birds scattering into the sky. For a split second, there was only confusion. Judge Markham felt a tremendous, invisible force strike him in the chest, a blow so powerful it staggered him backward and stole the air from his lungs. He looked at his friend, a question in his eyes, his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. He looked down. On the crisp white fabric of his shirt, a dark stain was beginning to bloom, spreading like a fatal flower. The abstract threats, the whispered warnings, the pleas of his wife, it all became real in that single, horrific instant. The long, complex legal argument he had been making against the powers that ran Breathitt County was over. A final, brutal rebuttal had just been delivered from a window across the street. His instincts, the instincts of a man whose entire life revolved around that building, took over. He did not cry out. He did not fall to the ground. With the last of his strength, he turned and stumbled back through the courthouse doors. He was a man of the law, and in his final moments, he sought sanctuary in the house of the law. He made it a few feet into the main hall before his legs gave out. Judge James B. Markham collapsed onto the hard wooden floor, his life ending at the very heart of the institution he had died trying to defend. For a long moment, nobody moved. The echo of the shot faded, replaced by a silence that was heavier and more profound than any noise. The people on the street were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. They had just witnessed the unthinkable, the public execution of a circuit judge on the steps of his own courthouse. It was an act of such brazen contempt for the law that it felt like the end of the world. This was not just a murder. It was a coronation. It was a statement, clear and undeniable, about who truly held the power in bloody Breathitt. The assassins, identified as Curtis Jett and Tom White, were known Hargis men. And the message they sent was simple and terrifying. No one was safe. No office was high enough. No principle was strong enough to protect you. The little Tsar's reign was absolute, and the courthouse itself was no longer a symbol of justice, but a tombstone for the man who dared to believe in it. From the dusty window of the building across the street, Curtis Jett and Tom White watched their handiwork unfold. The sharp, acrid scent of spent gunpowder hung in the still air of the room, a smell of finality. They saw Judge Markham stagger, saw him disappear back into the courthouse he loved. There was no panic, no rush of adrenaline-fueled fear, only the cold, clean satisfaction of a job well done. They were soldiers who had just successfully completed a mission for their commanding officer. Their next move was a testament to their chilling confidence. They didn't scramble to escape into the mountains. They didn't have a fast horse waiting in a back alley. They simply broke down the rifle, wrapped it in a cloth, and walked down the back stairs. They emerged into the pandemonium of the street, not as panicked fugitives, but as silent observers. They melted into the very crowd that was gathering in horrified knots, their faces as blank and unreadable as any other bystander. They were hiding in plain sight, protected by a shield of terror so absolute that no one dared to even meet their gaze. In the hours that followed, a strange paralysis gripped the town of Jackson. The body of Judge Markham was carried from the courthouse. The local law enforcement made a great show of securing the scene, of asking questions they already knew the answers to. Everyone knew who had pulled the trigger. The motive was as plain as the hole in the judge's chest. But who would dare to make the arrest? The town's legal system had just been decapitated, and the message was clear. Any lawman who tried to bring in Jet and White would be the next one to lie on a cold slab. And so, the killers did not run. They didn't have to. Later that day, they were seen openly in a Jackson store buying tobacco. They walked the streets with a new kind of swagger, the swagger of men who had proven they were untouchable. They were not fugitives cowering in the woods. They were conquerors, and the town of Jackson was their occupied territory. Their freedom in those first hours and days was the ultimate demonstration of Jim Hargis's power. The law was dead, and its assassins were calmly walking over its grave. The end of the road had not come for them. It had come for the rule of law in Breathitt County. The bullet that struck down Judge Markham didn't stop in the courthouse hall. It traveled onward, a phantom projectile that tore through the fabric of his family. For his wife, the abstract fear she had voiced just the night before had become a brutal, life-altering reality. She was now a widow in a town ruled by her husband's killers. His children were now orphans, their name a mark of defiance that placed them in constant, unspoken danger. The very community they had lived in became a prison of watching eyes and silent whispers. Friends who once greeted them warmly now averted their gaze, not out of malice, but out of a primal fear of being associated with the losing side of a war. For the Reform faction, Markham's assassination was a catastrophic blow. He was their legal champion, the man who believed he could slay the dragon with a well-aimed lawsuit. His death was the brutal answer to that belief. It ripped the heart out of their movement, replacing their hope for a lawful victory with the cold, hard reality of terror. A cloud of fear, thick and suffocating as mountain fog, descended on his allies. Men who had spoken boldly of reform now fell silent. The choice they faced was stark and immediate. Flee Breathitt County, bend the knee to the little Tsar, or pick up a rifle and answer violence with violence. The murder's ripple effect spread through the entire community. The town of Jackson became a place of profound paranoia. Shutters were bolted earlier in the evening. The streets, once a place of commerce and conversation, grew quiet and empty after dusk. Business between factions ceased entirely. A man's last name became his uniform, and the simple act of walking down the street was a declaration of allegiance. The courthouse, once the center of civic life, was now viewed with dread, no longer a house of law, but a monument to a failed idea. The assassination didn't end the violence, it guaranteed its escalation. The scales of justice, or what passed for it in the mountains, were now grotesquely unbalanced. Such a public and high-profile killing demanded an answer. The cycle of vengeance now required a blood payment of its own, and the Callahan faction, robbed of their legal path, began to see the gun as their only remaining option. The murder of the judge directly led to the murders that followed of the sitting sheriff and then of his successor, Ed Callahan himself. The tragedy of Judge Markham's death was not just his own. The wreckage left behind wasn't just a grieving family and a dead lawman. It was a shattered community, a broken faith in the idea of civilization itself. Jim Hargis had not just eliminated a rival, he had murdered hope. And in its place, he had enthroned fear as the one true king of bloody Breathitt. The murder of a circuit judge was an act so audacious it could not be ignored, not even by the distant state government in Frankfurt. The carnage in Breathitt County had become a national embarrassment. In 1904, the governor declared the county to be in a state of insurrection and sent in the militia. This was not a small detachment of men. It was an invasion force. Hundreds of soldiers armed with modern rifles and Gatling guns arrived on the train, marching through the streets of Jackson with fixed bayonets. They were a foreign army, sent to impose a foreign law. Their primary mission was to ensure that Curtis Jett and Tom White could be tried without the jury being intimidated or the courthouse being burned to the ground. The trial became a spectacle. The courthouse was no longer a public building. It was a military fortress. There were soldiers on the roof, a guard with a bayonet at every door. The proceedings inside were a perfect illustration of the clash between two worlds. The prosecution came with law books, eyewitness testimony from terrified citizens, and the complex machinery of the state's legal system. And on the other side sat Jett and White. They did not carry themselves as common criminals racked with guilt. They sat with a quiet, defiant arrogance, like captured soldiers being tried by an enemy tribunal. In their minds, and in the minds of their supporters, they had broken no real law. They had acted according to the ancient mountain code, loyalty to their chief. They had eliminated a threat to their clan and its leader. Their defense was not one of innocence, but of justification. They were merely the instruments of a will greater than their own, soldiers in a war that the men in powdered wigs could never understand. Outside the courthouse walls, Breathitt County held its breath, deeply and bitterly divided. To the Hargis loyalists, Jett and White were martyrs, loyal men being sacrificed to appease the Flatlanders in Frankfurt. They were symbols of resistance against an outside force trying to change their way of life. To the friends of James Markham and the shattered Reform faction, they were simply assassins. The trial was the last, desperate hope that the rule of law might mean something after all, that a killer could be held to account, no matter who he worked for. After weeks of testimony that kept the entire nation spellbound, the jury, protected by a wall of state rifles, returned its verdict: guilty. Both Curtis Jett and Tom White were sentenced to life in prison. The newspapers declared it a victory for justice. But in the hollows of Breathitt County, the question lingered. Was it justice? The trigger men were going to prison, but the man who had almost certainly loaded the gun and given the order, the man whose power they were protecting, James "Jim" Hargis, was never even charged. The law had proven it could cage the wolves, but it seemed powerless to touch the man who owned the forest. With Jett and White behind bars, you might think justice had finally, imperfectly, triumphed. But the other side of the coin was still in play. James "Jim" Hargis, the little Tsar, the man at the center of the storm, remained. The state militia eventually packed up their Gatling guns and went home. The trials were over, and Jim Hargis was still the king of Breathitt County. For years, he walked the streets of Jackson, a living testament to a chilling truth. The law could punish the soldiers, but it couldn't touch the general. He had won. He had broken the reform movement, eliminated his chief rival, and survived the full might of the state's intervention. But the mountains have their own way of balancing the books. The justice that finally found Jim Hargis didn't come with a judge's order or from the rifle of a sworn enemy. It came from inside his own house, from his own blood. In February of 1908, 4 years after the Great Invasion, a bitter argument broke out between Hargis and his son, Beach. We don't know for certain what it was about: money, power, a personal slight. But it was a fire that could not be put out. The very culture of violence that Hargis had cultivated to maintain his power had taken root in his own family. On a cold winter day, on a public street in the town he ruled, the final act of the tragedy played out. Beach Hargis confronted his father, and the argument ended the only way such disputes seemed to end, in bloody Breathitt. He pulled a gun and shot his father dead. The man who had orchestrated assassinations from the shadows, who had treated the county as his personal chessboard, was brought down not by the law or his political enemies, but by a simple, brutal family quarrel. There's a terrible poetic irony in his end. The state of Kentucky had failed to hold him accountable. The code of the mountains, which he had so expertly manipulated, was ultimately what destroyed him. He had lived by the sword of clan loyalty and died by the sword of a family feud. His death was not justice in the legal sense, but it was a grim and fitting final chapter for a man whose greatest legacy was the violence he left behind. With the little Tsar in his grave, put there by his own son, a strange and unfamiliar quiet settled over Breathitt County. The empire Jim Hargis had built through a lifetime of cunning and intimidation crumbled like a house of sand. There was no one to inherit his throne. The machine he had created was powered by his will alone, and without him, it ground to a halt. The name Hargis, once a word of power, became a whisper of shame, a cautionary tale of a man who ruled a kingdom and lost his own family. His descendants scattered, many leaving the county to escape the long, dark shadow of their name. On the other side of the ledger, the name Markham became something else entirely. It became a symbol of a lost cause, a ghost of what might have been. Judge Markham's family, seeking the peace he could not find for them in Jackson, eventually left the mountains. But they left his name behind, etched into the memory of the place. To this day, it stands for an honorable, if tragic, idea that the law should be something more than the will of the strongest man. But for the common folk of Breathitt, the years after were not about legacies. They were about survival. A profound and deliberate silence fell over the history of the feuds. It was a collective act of forgetting, a necessary amnesia. Fathers stopped telling their sons the stories. The names of the dead were still on the tombstones, but the reasons they were there were buried deep. To speak of the war was to risk reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar over, to reignite embers of hatred that still glowed in the dark. The community healed itself by cauterizing its own memory, choosing a future of silence over a past of pain. And into this silence, a new kind of power moved in. With the old patriarchs dead or disgraced, the county was left rudderless. The timber and coal companies from the outside no longer had to negotiate with a powerful little Tsar. They could now deal with a fractured, exhausted populace and a pliable local government. The great fight for Breathitt's soul did not end with the feuds. It had only entered a new phase. The rifle was put away, and the lawyer's briefcase took its place. The land and its wealth, which had been fought over with blood, would now be claimed with ink. The men who fought the Breathitt County War are long gone. Their rifles have turned to rust, their bodies to dust. But their story has not disappeared. It has seeped into the soil of the county itself, a permanent part of the landscape. And the most enduring echo of that bloody time is the name it earned, Bloody Breathitt. For more than a century, the people of this place have lived with that nickname. It clings to them like morning fog in the hollows, a ghost of a reputation they can never fully shake, a constant reminder of the time when their home was a battlefield. If you walk the streets of Jackson today, you can still touch the past. The old courthouse still stands, a silent brick-and-mortar witness to the murder that defined an era. And a persistent local legend says that the judge never truly left. On quiet nights, when the building is dark and empty, some people claim you can hear the faint sound of a man's footsteps, pacing the hall where Judge Markham fell. It's the ghost of a man who died for the law, still restlessly seeking the justice that was denied to him in life. Not far from there, in a quiet cemetery, you can find the weathered tombstones of Markham, of Hargis, of Callahan, their names worn by 100 years of rain and wind, the silent epilogue to a violent history. The story of the feuds is rarely found in official history books. It lives on in the way mountain people preserve their past, in stories told on a front porch, in hushed tones from one generation to the next. It has become a cautionary tale, a lesson taught to the young about the terrible price of pride and the destructive power of vengeance. The specific details may blur, the names may fade, but the core of the story remains. A warning about the darkness that can be unleashed when good men do nothing and powerful men do as they please. the spirits of the two main antagonists still haunt the county in their own ways. The ghost of Judge Markham is a sad one, a symbol of principle and sacrifice. But the ghost of Jim Hargis is something else entirely. It is the ghost of absolute power, of a time when one man's will could override all law and morality. He represents the old, untamed spirit of the mountains, both its strength and its terrifying brutality. Though the man is gone, his shadow, the memory of that kind of power, lingers as a reminder of what this place once was. So we come to the end of the trail and return to the question that started it all. Was this a land of savages or a place of honorable men locked in a desperate struggle? The truth is, it was both. There were no simple heroes or villains in the story of Bloody Breathitt. There were only men, forged by their time and place, and trapped by the very codes that gave them their strength. Jim Hargis was not a monster. He was a king from an older, fiercer world, a mountain patriarch who ruled by a law of loyalty and fear, and who defended his kingdom with savage brutality when it was threatened. And Judge James Markham was not a naive fool. He was a prophet of a new order, a man who believed that the rule of law could tame the wilderness and bring a just peace to the mountains. His tragedy was that he was a man ahead of his time, who fatally underestimated the violence with which the old world would resist its own death. They were two titans of two different ages, standing on the same small piece of earth, and there was simply not enough room for both of them. In the end, this is not just a story about a feud. It is the story of a painful, bloody transition. It's the story of what happens when the unwritten law of the mountains, a code of honor, clan, and vengeance, collides with the written law of the state. The gunshots that echoed through the hollows were the death rattle of an entire way of life, a brutal response to the encroaching forces of industry, money, and a government that the mountain people had never trusted. The blood that soaked the courthouse steps was the terrible price of that change. And that, my friends, is the Ballad of Bloody Breathitt. It is a grim and lasting reminder that a man's greatest strength can become his most profound weakness, and that when the old ways of a place are forced to die, they seldom die quietly. Two days shy of her 41st birthday, shotgun blasts ripped through the quiet hills of the Indian Territory. She was shot in the back, a coward's ambush. The woman they called the Bandit Queen lay dead in the dirt, just feet from her own gate. The dime novels painted her as a female Jesse James, a ruthless outlaw. But that's the legend. How does a girl who mastered Greek and the piano, born to a respectable family, end her days this way? Today, we separate the truth from the lies to find the real Myra Maybelle Shirley and to ask the question that still haunts these hills: who wanted her dead? Before the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley. She wasn't born in a dusty outlaw camp, but into a life of relative comfort in Carthage, Missouri. Her father, John Shirley, was a respected farmer, innkeeper, and judge, a man of property and standing. Their home sat on the very edge of civilization, where the rolling prairies gave way to the rugged ancient Ozark Hills. It was a land with a soul much like Appalachia's, a place of tight-knit clans, fierce independence, and memories as long and deep as the valleys themselves. The roots of that spirit ran deep in Myra's blood. Her mother, Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, came from the same line as the notorious Hatfields of the West Virginia-Kentucky border. This wasn't just a distant relation, it was a heritage. It meant that Myra was born into a world where honor was defended with fists and firearms, where loyalty to family was the highest law, and where an insult was a debt that would one day be paid in full. This was the unwritten code of the mountains, a code she understood long before she ever read a law book. On the surface, however, Myra was being molded into a proper southern lady. Her father sent her to the Carthage Female Academy, a place of refinement and learning. She studied the classics, mastered Greek and Latin, and could fill the Shirley home with the beautiful, complex notes of a piano sonata. She was intelligent, articulate, and poised, everything a daughter of a prominent family was expected to be. She was destined for a life of quiet dignity, of ball gowns and polite conversation. But beneath the corset and silk beat the heart of a rebel. The same girl who could quote Greek philosophers was more at home in the saddle, racing her horse through the woods with a freedom most women of her time could only dream of. She preferred the company of her older brother, Bud, and his friends, learning from them the ways of the wilderness. She could handle a shotgun with a skill that shamed grown men and knew the hidden trails of the Ozarks as if they were lines on the palm of her hand. Two worlds were at war inside this young woman: the polished, respectable world her father was building for her, and the wild, untamed world of the hills that flowed in her Hatfield blood. For a time, she could walk in both. But a storm was gathering on the horizon of America, a storm of fire and steel that would sweep across the nation, and it would force Myra Maybelle Shirley to choose, once and for all, which world she truly belonged to. Little did she know that choice would burn the life she knew to the ground. If the Ozark Hills were the anvil of Myra's character, the Civil War was the hammer that shattered it and reforged it into something hard and sharp. When the war came, it didn't just divide the nation, it ripped through Missouri, turning neighbor against neighbor in a savage guerrilla conflict. The Shirley family didn't hesitate. Their loyalty was to the Confederacy, and their home soon became a clandestine way station for the most feared Southern partisans, the bushwhackers. Men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, men who fought with a cold fury, found refuge under the Shirley roof. And riding with them were boys who would become legends in their own right, the James brothers and the Younger brothers. This was the world that consumed Myra Maybelle. She saw these men not as outlaws, but as heroes defending their homes. And her greatest hero was her own brother, Edwin, whom everyone called Bud. He was everything she admired: brave, defiant, and free. When he joined the bushwhackers, Myra's war began. The polite young lady from the academy vanished, replaced by a cunning operative for the Southern cause. Legends say she would use her charm and education to flirt with Union officers, prying information from them about troop movements, which she would then pass on to her brother and his comrades. She became a scout, a spy, a vital part of the shadow war being fought in the Missouri hills. For a time, it must have felt like a dangerous, righteous adventure. She was fighting alongside her brother, defending her family's beliefs. The risk was real, but so was the adrenaline, the sense of purpose. She was no longer just a girl playing piano, she was a player in the great bloody drama of her time. But this was no adventure, and the price of this war was about to be brought to her door in the most brutal way imaginable. In 1864, the hammer fell. Federal troops, tired of the constant raids and ambushes, hunted down Bud Shirley. He was trapped, cornered, and killed. For 16-year-old Myra, the news wasn't just devastating, it was the end of her world. The light of her life, her protector, her idol, was gone, slain by the very men she saw as foreign invaders. In that moment, her girlish patriotism and grief curdled into something far darker, a cold, permanent, all-consuming hatred. A hatred for the government, for its uniforms, for its laws. They had taken her brother, and in doing so, they had taken a part of her soul. The war might end for the country, but for Myra Shirley, it would never be over. She would spend the rest of her life fighting the victors. After the war, the Shirley family fled to Texas, seeking a new life from the ashes of the old. But for Myra, peace was a foreign country. Her heart, forged in hatred, was drawn to the fire. She found that fire in the eyes of the men who, like her brother Bud, refused to surrender. Men like the charismatic Cole Younger, a childhood friend and now a notorious outlaw. Rumors would later whisper of a passionate affair, claiming her daughter Pearl was his. It was a romantic story, but likely just that, a story. The truth, however, was no less dangerous. Her first husband was Jim Reed, another former bushwhacker who couldn't trade his pistol for a plow. With him, Myra stepped fully into the world of the outlaw. Their life was a blur of stolen horses and dodging posses, a frantic existence on the run. In this chaos, her two children, Pearl and Eddie, were born. But this was no family portrait. It was a partnership born of war and rebellion, and it was destined to end in blood. In 1874, Jim Reed's luck ran out. The news that reached Myra was cold and brutal. Her husband had been shot down, not in a blaze of glory, but by an acquaintance who valued the reward money more than friendship. At 26, Myra was a widow, a mother of two, and officially branded the accomplice of a dead bandit. This was the world she had chosen, a world with no honor among thieves. So she moved deeper into the shadows, to a place where the law of the United States was thin and the old ways were strong, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. There, she met and married Sam Starr, a man from a proud Cherokee family. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the founding of a dynasty. On their land, tucked away in the rugged hills, they established a stronghold. It had a name that was a tribute to her old friends and a warning to her new enemies: Younger's Bend. Younger's Bend wasn't a ranch. It was a sanctuary for the damned. It was a place where men on the run, men like Jesse James and the Younger brothers themselves, could find a hot meal, a fresh horse, and a place to lay low, protected by the cunning of its queen. The air there was thick with the smell of wood smoke, whiskey, and paranoia. Every rider on the horizon was either a friend or a hangman. This was the heart of darkness, a kingdom built on stolen goods and guarded by guns. Here, the final transformation of Myra Maybelle Shirley was complete. She was no longer just a bandit's wife, she was the mastermind. She never led a charge, her hands weren't on the triggers during the robberies. Her weapons were her intellect and her will. She planned the heists, fenced the stolen property, bribed officials, and used her deep knowledge of the law to tangle up prosecutors in court. And she crafted an image that became a legend. She would ride into town on a fine horse, sitting side-saddle in a velvet dress like a proper lady, but on her hips, for all the world to see, rested two Colt revolvers. She could quote classical poetry one moment and arrange the sale of a stolen herd the next. This walking contradiction, the refined lady and the criminal queen, was her armor and her declaration of war. She had created a monster, and her name was Belle Starr. The two shotgun blasts echoed through the hills and then faded into an unnerving quiet. Belle Starr's horse, spooked and riderless, galloped the rest of the way to the ranch house, its panicked whinny the first alarm. Her daughter Pearl, hearing the sound, ran out to see what was wrong. The discovery she made in the mud of the road, just outside their own gate, would become the final bloody chapter of her mother's legend. The bandit queen was dead, her velvet riding habit stained with the earth and her own blood, her back riddled with buckshot. News of a murder like that travels fast, even in the isolated Indian Territory. It moved from ranch to ranch on the lips of breathless riders, then crackled across the telegraph wires to the newspapers in Fort Smith and beyond. The death of Belle Starr was an event. For the lawmen, it was the closing of a long and frustrating case file. For the dime novelists, it was a dramatic ending they couldn't have written better themselves. For the locals, it was a source of fear and feverish gossip. The queen was dead. But who had dared to kill her? Soon enough, Deputy U.S. Marshals rode down the trail to Younger's Bend. For years, this place had been a no-go zone, a sanctuary for fugitives where the law entered at its own peril. Now, they were in charge. picking through the life of the woman who had so often made fools of them. The investigation began, and the web of suspects was tangled and dark, spun from the threads of Belle's own life. Every person in her orbit had a potential motive. The first and most obvious suspect was a man named Edgar Watson. He was a tenant on Belle's land, a man with a shadowy past from Florida, rumored to be wanted for murder himself. They had argued bitterly. Belle wanted him gone, and Watson wasn't a man who liked being told what to do. It was a simple, logical motive, a dispute over land and money that ended in violence. But the simple answer isn't always the true one. Then there was her own husband, a Cherokee man named Jim July Starr. He was younger than Belle and was, at the time of her murder, facing his own trial for horse theft. Did they have a falling out? Was he driven by jealousy? Or, as some whispered, did he arrange the murder to silence her before she could testify in some secret deal with the law? He had an alibi, but in the murky world of Younger's Bend, an alibi was just another story. The silence that fell over the hills wasn't one of peace. It was a silence of fear. Belle's network of outlaws scattered, not knowing who among them might be next, or who might sell them out for a pardon. A reward was posted for information, but few dared to speak. The killer was still out there, and no one knew how far their reach extended. The hunt was on, not just for a murderer, but for the truth behind the final bloody act of the bandit queen's life. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in the case of Belle Starr's murder, they seemed to grind through mud. The primary suspect, Edgar Watson, was finally brought to trial. You can just imagine the scene in the Fort Smith courtroom. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle. The room was packed with a tense mix of lawmen, curious townsfolk, and shadowed figures in the back rows, friends and enemies of the dead woman, all there to see how this final chapter would play out. The air itself felt heavy, thick with whispered theories and cold stares. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was waiting for a conviction. The prosecution laid out its case. They painted a picture of a bitter dispute between a landlord and her troublesome tenant. They spoke of threats exchanged, of Watson's notorious temper, and of his presence near the scene of the crime. They presented him as a man with a motive, the means, and the opportunity. But their case was like a house built on sand. There was no murder weapon. There were no direct eyewitnesses to the shooting. The entire argument rested on bad blood and circumstantial evidence, a foundation that began to crumble under the slightest pressure. Watson, for his part, sat there with a cold confidence. He was no frightened farmer caught in the gears of the law. This was a man who understood the violence of the world. His defense lawyers didn't just deny his guilt. They threw the courtroom doors wide open to the chaos of Belle's life. They argued that putting only Edgar Watson on trial was absurd. Why not her husband, Jim July, who had his own legal troubles? Why not any of the dozens of spurned lovers, jilted partners, or vengeful victims Belle had created over the years? To have an enemy, they argued, was to be Belle Starr's acquaintance. And then, the darkest rumor of all, a chilling whisper that slithered through the courtroom, gave everyone pause. The story of Belle and her own son, Eddie. Their relationship was poison. He was a disappointment, and she was a harsh mother. The gossip was that just before her death, she had taken a whip to him for mistreating her favorite horse. Had the boy's resentment finally boiled over into an unspeakable act? Could he have pulled the trigger himself, or perhaps paid Watson to do it for him? It was a monstrous thought, but in the world Belle had built, it wasn't an impossible one. Faced with a weak case and a sea of reasonable doubt, the jury was trapped. They could condemn a man on suspicion, or they could let a potential killer walk free. They deliberated, and when they returned, the foreman's voice cut through the silence. "Not guilty." A shockwave went through the room. Edgar Watson, the man everyone was so sure had done it, stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man. And so the law of men had spoken. But was it justice? Or was it just a failure of a system that couldn't comprehend the complex, violent world of Younger's Bend? The court case was closed, but the murder remained unsolved. The killer had vanished back into the hills, becoming just another ghost in the bloody history of the territory. The truth, it seemed, was buried with the bandit queen. The murder of Belle Starr wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosion that scattered the pieces. Her kingdom, Younger's Bend, crumbled without its queen. The outlaws who had found sanctuary there drifted away, seeking new shadows to hide in. The land itself was eventually swallowed up by the relentless tide of settlement and progress. Today, what was once the most notorious hideout in the Indian Territory lies quiet and still, submerged beneath the placid waters of Lake Eufaula. A concrete historical marker stands on a nearby hill, a lone sentinel pointing toward the drowned land, the only official sign that this infamous chapter of the West ever happened here. The fates of those in her orbit were as tangled and often as tragic as her own. Edgar Watson, the acquitted suspect, moved on, but his reputation followed him. He eventually met a violent end himself, gunned down by a vigilante mob in Florida. Her last husband, Jim July Starr, died in a gunfight with lawmen not long after Belle's murder. Her son, Eddie Reed, who some whispered was the true killer, lived a troubled life, eventually becoming a deputy sheriff himself before being killed in a saloon brawl. It seems the violence that Belle had courted her whole life clung to those she left behind, an inescapable inheritance. But there is one final strange twist. Her daughter Pearl, the one rumored to be Cole Younger's child, chose a different path of rebellion. She turned her back on the world of guns and stolen horses and moved to Fort Smith, where she opened a high-class brothel. In a way, she too became a queen, presiding over her own illicit kingdom, a world with its own codes and dangers, just a stone's throw from the courthouse where her mother's killer had been set free. The strongest echo of Belle Starr, however, is not in the ground, but in the story itself. After her death, the legend took on a life of its own. A journalist named Richard Fox penned a lurid book called Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the Female Jesse James. It was a work of pure fiction, filled with sensational tales of her leading bank robberies and stagecoach heists, things she never actually did. This book, and the countless dime novels that followed, created the image we think of today, the pistol-packing outlaw in a feathered hat. The myth completely consumed the woman. You can still visit her grave, tucked away in the woods not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. The original headstone, carved with a bell, a star, and a poignant poem, was chipped away to nothing by souvenir hunters over the decades. A new, protected monument stands in its place. And as you stand there, in the quiet of those Oklahoma hills, you realize the mountains do remember. They remember the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, the educated girl, the grieving sister, the cunning organizer, and the woman who gambled her life on a defiant dream of freedom and lost. So we return to the question that has hung in the air since those shotgun blasts first rang out. Who killed Belle Starr? The law of men never gave us a name. Was it the vengeful tenant, Edgar Watson? Was it one of her own family, a final, terrible betrayal? We will never know for sure. But maybe the real answer isn't a name. Maybe what killed Belle Starr was the violent, lawless world she had so carefully constructed around herself. In the end, the snake she had nurtured in the heart of Younger's Bend finally turned and bit its queen. Her story is a powerful reminder that the Civil War didn't truly end at Appomattox. It continued to rage in the hearts of people like Myra Shirley, leaving scars that festered into a deep and abiding hatred for the authority that had won. She was not a hero. She was not the cartoon villain of the penny press. She was a casualty, a woman whose fierce mountain pride, when poisoned by grief, became a force of self-destruction. She waged a 25-year war against a world she felt had wronged her, and in that war, There could only be one victor. Myra Maybelle Shirley was a woman of stark contradictions, the educated lady who could quote the classics and the ruthless godmother who ruled a den of thieves. She was born with the spirit of the mountains in her blood, proud, defiant, and unforgiving. But that spirit, when broken, forged a legend written in gunsmoke and blood. A girl who was meant to be a lady became the bandit queen, a cautionary tale that still echoes in the hills where she once rode. The North Wagon Gate of Moundsville Penitentiary groaned as the torch cut through its iron heart. In the next instant, a storm of lead ripped through the opening and the rebellion was over. The newspapers screamed that 3 dangerous convicts had been brought to justice. But the men who survived that day, the ones left behind in the cold and the dark, they whispered a different story. They said it wasn't a firefight, it was an execution. Today, we will walk back into that blood-soaked prison and ask the question that has haunted those stone walls for a century. Was it justice, or was it murder? Before the riot, there was the silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that filled the long stone corridors of the West Virginia Penitentiary. From the outside, the prison looked like a nightmare castle, its Gothic towers clawing at the sky above the small town of Moundsville. It was built to look like a fortress, and it was. A fortress designed to hold the human misery overflowing from the coal fields and hard-scrabble hollows of Appalachia. The men inside were the sons of miners, loggers, and farmers, men broken by a world that had little use for them except for the sweat of their brow or the strength of their back. By 1929, that fortress was a pressure cooker, filled with over 1,000 souls where only 400 were meant to be. The world inside was a grim, repeating ritual of degradation. The day began and ended in a cell built for one man, but now crammed with 2, sometimes 3. A space just 5 feet by 7 feet, with a foul bucket in the corner and the sour smell of unwashed bodies clinging to the damp stone. This wasn't living, it was being stored like cordwood. The one break in the monotony was the dining hall, but it offered no relief. The food was the stuff of legend, and not in a good way. Men were served spoiled meat and bread crawling with weevils, ladled from vats that were rarely cleaned. It was a diet designed not for sustenance, but for submission. It weakened the body and corroded the spirit, a constant reminder that you were less than human, an animal to be fed slop. The guards ruled this kingdom of decay with fists and clubs. They were underpaid, often uneducated men given absolute power over the lives of others, and they used it. A misplaced word, a defiant look, anything could earn you a beating. And for the truly unlucky, there was the hole. A black, airless pit in the prison's bowels where a man was left with nothing but his own screaming thoughts. A place where sanity went to die in the dark. This was the calm that came before the storm. A world of quiet desperation where every sunrise promised another day of the same slow death. But something was changing in the air. You could see it in the eyes of the men shuffling in the yard, a harder glint of defiance replacing the dull stare of despair. The pressure inside those walls had been building for years, and the old stone itself seemed to groan under the strain. The men inside had nothing, and a man with nothing is a man with nothing left to lose. You have to understand, the feud that boiled over in Moundsville didn't start inside those walls. Its roots run deep, down into the very rock and soil of West Virginia. This is a state born from a fight, cleaved from Virginia in the fires of the Civil War. It's a land of coal and blood, where generations of men learned a hard lesson. Everything worth having must be fought for, and the men in charge will never give it up easy. The old scars of history were still fresh in 1929. The West Virginia mine wars were not a distant memory. They were an open wound. Men locked in Moundsville had likely stood on the picket lines. They had seen company thugs beat their friends. They had heard the machine guns at Blair Mountain just 8 years earlier. They had fought a literal war against the coal operators and the state militia. and they had lost. That fight taught them two things: a burning hatred for any authority that wore a uniform, and the cold knowledge that sometimes the only way to be heard is through the barrel of a gun. The prison was just the final chapter in a story that began in the company towns. There was a direct pipeline from the mine to the penitentiary. When a man was used up, injured, or blacklisted for trying to unionize, he was often left with nothing. Poverty and desperation would lead to moonshining, to theft, to a fight in a saloon. And the same law that protected the company's profits would come down on him like a hammer. The men filling Moundsville's cells weren't just criminals. They were the discarded, angry remnants of a brutal industrial war. In these mountains, a man's pride was often the only thing he owned. He might not have 2 cents to rub together, but he had his name and he had his honor. The system inside Moundsville was designed to strip that away, to grind a man down to a number. But you cannot take the fight out of a mountain man so easily. To be from West Virginia meant you might get knocked down, but you never stayed down. That defiant spirit, the same one that fueled the Union battles, didn't die at the prison gate. It just went underground, waiting for a spark. The feud wasn't between 3 inmates and a warden. It was the continuation of an old, bitter war between the forgotten men of the mountains and the system that was built to crush them. A prison is a world of whispers. In a place like Moundsville, where the walls sweated misery, the grapevine was a twisted, venomous thing. It was the only source of news, and it thrived on fear and suspicion. Word would travel from cell to cell, passed in hushed tones during meal lines or shouted through drain pipes at night. Rumors became facts, and facts became legends. The men whispered about the parole board, convinced it was a sham, that a man's freedom wasn't earned by good behavior, but bought with money they didn't have. This wasn't just a faceless system they hated. The grudges were deeply personal. There were guards known for their particular brand of cruelty, men who seemed to enjoy the sound of a hickory stick cracking against bone. An inmate who had been beaten unjustly wouldn't forget the face of the man who held him down. A family on the outside that was denied a visit for a petty reason wouldn't forget the name of the guard who turned them away. These weren't just inmates and guards. They were neighbors from warring hollows, now locked in a cage together. Frank Heyer, the man they called the ringleader, was known for his sharp mind. He'd likely tried to fight the system with words first, filing grievances that were ignored, trying to reason with an authority that had no interest in reason. Each dismissed complaint was another nail in the coffin of a peaceful solution. Everett Lilly, the muscle, was a different story. His was a language of fists and fury. His file was likely thick with reports of brawls with guards, each one earning him a trip to the hole, each stay in the darkness hardening his resolve into pure, diamond-hard hatred. The air was thick with the poison of betrayal. The most feared man in Moundsville wasn't the toughest killer. It was the snitch. The constant threat of an informant turning a quiet complaint into a charge of conspiracy meant no one could be trusted. This paranoia turned men against each other, but it also forged unlikely alliances. Small, tight-knit groups formed, bound by the simple code of the mountains. You look after your own. And in the winter of 1929, the whispers began to change. They were no longer just about spoiled food or crooked guards. They were about taking a stand. The old grudges were simmering, and the web of rumors was pulling tight, getting ready to snap. In the weeks leading up to the riot, a strange chill settled over Moundsville, a cold that had nothing to do with the March weather. The old-timers, the men who had grown grey inside those walls, they knew the signs. It was like the unnatural quiet that falls over the hollow just before a tornado hits. A deep, listening silence. Men spoke less and watched more. Even the rats, the true kings of the prison, were said to have grown agitated and bold, as if they sensed the coming feast of chaos. Then the omen came, not in the form of a strange bird or a bad dream, but in cold black ink on a newspaper smuggled inside. Governor William Conley had given an interview declaring his iron-fisted policy on the state's criminals. There would be no coddling, no leniency, and absolutely no negotiating with convicts. To the men shivering in their cells, these weren't the words of a politician, they were a prophecy. It was the outside world officially telling them that their letters would go unread, their pleas would go unheard, and their suffering was of no concern. The last door to a peaceful solution had just been slammed shut and bolted from the outside. Frank Heyer lay on his cot in the dark, listening to the symphony of the dying. The tubercular coughs from the next cell, the distant clang of a steel door, the soft scuttling of vermin in the walls. He wasn't a prophet, but he could read the signs as well as any man. He could feel the threads of desperation, anger and betrayal pulling together into a single tight knot in the center of the prison. It was a gut-wrenching feeling, a premonition not of what might happen, but of what must happen. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the stone floor, that they were about to step into a darkness from which none of them would ever truly return. The morning of March 21st, 1929, began like any other in that cold, grey hell. The air tasted of damp stone and coal smoke. Deputy Warden James P. Mearns was making his rounds, his footsteps echoing with authority in the prison's vast central rotunda. This was the iron heart of the institution, the nerve center from which the entire prison was controlled. Mearns walked his familiar path with the confidence of a man who believed he was in absolute command, oblivious to the three shadows detaching themselves from the walls. They moved like ghosts: Frank Heyer, Everett Lilly, and Walter Legg. One moment, they were just inmates shuffling past. The next, they were a single, lethal entity. There was no warning, no shouted demand, just a sudden, violent closing of a circle, a flash of sharpened steel, spoons and bed springs honed over countless nights into crude, deadly shivs. Mearns barely had time to register the threat before he was overwhelmed. The struggle was short and brutal. One moment, he was the master of this domain. The next, he was prey, the cold point of a prison-made knife pressed against his ribs. They didn't just hold him. They dragged him, struggling and terrified, to the circular iron cage that stood in the very center of the rotunda. This cage was the ultimate symbol of the guards' power, the perch from which they could watch over the cell blocks like gods on a steel throne. In a single defiant act, the inmates shoved Mearns inside and slammed the heavy door. The loud clang of that lock echoed through the prison, a sound that was both a death knell and a declaration of war. The watchers had become the watched. That sound was the spark that hit the powder. News of the warden's capture spread not like a whisper, but like a roar. A deep, guttural sound that erupted from the cell blocks. 1,000 voices joined in a single, primal scream of rage and triumph. It was the sound of chains breaking, of pressure valves exploding. In minutes, the riot was in full flood. Inmates overpowered the few guards on the interior, seizing control of the cell blocks and the dining hall. The prison, a place of rigid order, descended into controlled chaos. This was it. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. By seizing a hostage and taking over the prison, Heyer, Lilly, and Legg had committed an act of open rebellion against the state of West Virginia. There would be no talking their way out of this. There would be no plea for leniency. On that cold March morning, in the heart of their own prison, they had signed their own death warrants. The only question left was how many men they would take with them. For 26 hours, the prison held its breath. Then, from the north wagon gate, came a sound that signaled the end. It was the high, screaming hiss of an acetylene torch, a sound that cut through the cold air and sliced away the last, thin thread of hope. To the state police outside, it was the sound of progress. To the men inside, it was the sound of the executioner sharpening his axe. Heyer, Lilly, and Legg heard it. They knew what it meant. In a final desperate gamble, they dragged Deputy Mearns from the cage and hauled him toward the groaning gate. Were they using him as a human shield? Were they planning one last defiant stand in the doorway? Or were they simply men cornered by fate, running blindly towards the noise and the fire? No one will ever know. All we know is that they moved toward the very violence they had summoned. Then, with a screech of tortured metal, a section of the gate gave way. A ragged hole opened up, and for one fraction of a second, the scene was frozen in a terrible tableau. Through the swirling smoke of the torch, the assault team saw 3 defiant silhouettes framed against the dim light of the prison interior, the terrified form of Mearns caught between them. It was a picture of pure, cornered desperation. The world then exploded in a single deafening roar, an eruption of sound and muzzle flash so violent it seemed to shake the very foundations of the prison. A volley of bullets tore through the newly made opening, a storm of lead that didn't distinguish between rebel and hostage. The air was filled with the sharp crack of rifles, the metallic shriek of ricochets off steel and stone, and the thick, choking smell of gun smoke. It was over in an instant. The defiant silhouettes in the gateway were simply gone. They didn't fall. They were erased, slammed back into the darkness by the sheer force of the volley. One moment they were men making a stand, the next they were just heaps of grey prison cloth on the cold stone floor. A third figure staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face before collapsing into the spreading shadows. Through the smoke, hands reached in and pulled Deputy Mearns out into the daylight. He was alive, untouched by the bullets, but forever haunted by the sounds and the fury of those final seconds. As the state police poured through the breach, a profound and unnatural silence fell over the rotunda. The Great Rebellion had not been crushed in a battle. It had been ended with a single, brutal, and overwhelming act of violence. The wisps of gun smoke curling out of the opening looked like the last desperate gasps of 3 men who had dared to ask for dignity and were answered with hot lead. To understand what happened at Moundsville, you have to try and crawl inside the minds of the men who started it. What switch flips inside a man to make him take a life-or-death gamble where the odds are impossibly stacked against him? This wasn't the work of mad dogs. It was something far more chilling. It was the result of a terrible, twisted logic born in darkness. For Frank Heyer, it was likely a problem of mathematics. He had calculated every other possibility, and each one added up to 0. To him, the state wasn't an authority to be respected, it was a machine to be jammed. Taking a hostage was simply the only tool big enough to stop the gears from grinding them all to dust. The transformation from desperate inmate to armed rebel wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, cold burn. It happened every morning they woke up in a filthy cell. It happened every time they were fed rotten food. The final switch, though, the one that turned thought into action, likely flipped when they read Governor Conley's declaration. That was the moment the system officially told them they were not human. In that instant, they stopped being prisoners seeking justice and became soldiers in a war they knew they could not win. When they saw Deputy Warden Mearns walking alone, it was no longer a question of if they would act, but simply how. And what did they feel in those 26 hours of stolen freedom? It couldn't have been simple triumph. It must have been a terrifying cocktail of euphoria and dread. For the first time in years, they were men who gave orders, not men who took them. They held the power of life and death. That power is a potent drug. But beneath it, there had to be a cold, clear understanding of the end game. They were smart enough to know that no governor would ever bow to them. They were standing on the gallows, having a final defiant smoke. After the initial violence, after Mearns was locked in that cage and the roar of the inmates echoed in their ears, I don't believe they felt relief or satisfaction. I believe they felt a chilling emptiness. They had crossed the final line. The world had shrunk to the size of that prison rotunda. There were no more choices to make, no more avenues of appeal. There was only the siege, the wait, and the inevitable violent end. They had traded a slow death in a cage for a quick one in a firefight. In their minds, it may have been the only honorable transaction left to make. The silence that followed the final gunshot was heavier than any stone in that prison. It was a dead, suffocating quiet that swallowed the echoes of the volley. Through the hole in the gate, the state police poured in, their boots crunching on unseen debris, their rifles ready for a fight that was already over. The air was thick with the bitter smell of burnt metal and cordite, a fog that clung to the cold air like a shroud. And there, in the dim light of the rotunda, lay the rebellion. 3 crumpled shapes on the floor, their brief, violent reign ended in a hail of lead. The dream of a new day died with the sound of iron doors slamming shut. As guards swarmed the interior, the brief illusion of inmate control was brutally shattered. The men who had screamed in triumph just a day before were now herded back into their cells with curses and the sharp crack of hickory clubs. The euphoria was gone, replaced by a cold, stomach-turning dread. They had gambled everything and lost in the most absolute way possible. Hope is a fragile thing in a place like Moundsville, and it had just been murdered right in front of them. Deputy Warden Mearns, shaken but physically whole, was a free man. But the other survivors, the 1,000 inmates locked back in their cages, were now more captive than ever. They had tasted a moment of power, and the system would never let them forget the price of that taste. They knew what was coming. A wave of retribution, a cold, methodical punishment that would be far worse than the conditions they had been protesting. The fight for better food was over. The fight to simply survive the coming vengeance had just begun. The official machinery of the state moved quickly. The bodies of Haya, Lily, and Leg were carried out, not as fallen men, but as evidence to be processed. The warden and the governor prepared their statements for the swarm of reporters waiting outside. The story they told was simple, clean, and brutal. A dangerous uprising had been met with necessary force. Justice had been served. But inside the walls, the guards began their own kind of investigation. They started pulling men from their cells, one by one. The siege of Moundsville was over, but the hunt for every man who had stood with the leaders, that hunt was just beginning. The riot didn't just end at the gate. It bled out into the town of Moundsville itself, drawing a jagged line down the middle of the community. In the saloons and general stores, the talk was low and angry. On one side were the families of the guards, the shop owners, the respectable folk. To them, Here and Lily were rabid animals, and the state police were heroes who had saved the town from a bloodbath. They saw the prison not as a place of suffering, but as a necessary wall to keep the darkness contained. But there was another side, a quieter, more fearful one. It was the side of the mothers, wives, and brothers of the men locked inside. They knew the stories of the spoiled food and the beatings. In the grim faces of the dead rioters, they saw their own kin. They didn't condone the violence, but in their hearts, they understood the desperation that fueled it. They spoke in whispers, terrified that any sympathy shown for the inmates would bring the law's wrath down upon their own houses. Inside the walls, the division was even more brutal. The riot had shattered the fragile inmate society, creating a new and deadly caste system. There were the men who had stood with the leaders, now marked for retribution. There were the men who had cowered in their cells, now viewed with contempt. And then there were the rats, the most despised of all, who saw the aftermath as a golden opportunity to trade information for favor from the guards. The air grew thick with a poison of suspicion. Every friendly word could be a lie, every shared glance a potential betrayal. A conspiracy of silence descended upon the cell blocks, but it was a silence born of pure terror, not loyalty. The guards began their interrogations, dragging men to the hole to beat names out of them. This created an impossible choice. To speak a name to the guards meant becoming a snitch, a death sentence under the inmate's own brutal code. To stay silent meant enduring the guards' methodical cruelty with no guarantee of survival. Men were caught between two forms of execution, a quick shiv in the yard from an inmate or a slow death in the dark at the hands of the law. In this crucible of fear, you saw the true measure of a man. You saw cowardice in the inmate who, after a single slap, pointed a trembling finger at a man who had nothing to do with the riot, just to make the pain stop. But you also saw a different kind of courage. You saw the man who took a beating, who was starved and broken in the hole, but who gritted his teeth and gave up nothing, holding on to the last shred of his honor. The community had been fractured, and on both sides of the wall, people were being forced to decide what kind of soul they truly had. The hunt began, but not with dogs and trackers in the West Virginia hills. It took place within the suffocating confines of the prison walls. The prey was not running. They were caged, helpless. The prison itself became the mountain range, a labyrinth of steel canyons and stone cliffs where every shadow could hide an enemy. The posse wasn't made of lawmen seeking justice. It was formed from the ranks of the prison's own guards, men who had been humiliated and held at bay for 26 hours, and now they were burning for revenge. Led by a captain whose reputation was as hard as the hickory club he carried, this posse of vengeance began its slow, methodical sweep. They weren't looking for evidence. They were looking for names. They moved through the cell blocks in the dead of night, their faces grim and unreadable in the flickering lamplight. The only sounds were the jangle of keys, the squeak of a guard's boots on the stone floor, and the sudden sharp cry of a man pulled from his cell. The chase was a psychological war of attrition. They used the snitches first, dangling promises of better food or an early parole hearing in exchange for a name. Every inmate became a potential Judas, and the terror of betrayal was a tangible thing, colder than the winter draft that snaked through the bars. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder during the riot now looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who would be the first to break. The wall of inmate solidarity, which had seemed so strong, began to crumble under the relentless pressure. The moment of capture was a scene of brutal efficiency. A cell door would crash open without warning. 3 or 4 guards would flood the tiny space, their faces set like stone. There was no warrant read, no rights given. A name would be barked out, and a man would be hauled from his bunk. Some fought back, a final futile explosion of defiance that was answered with the dull, sickening thud of a club. Others went limp, their eyes wide with the knowledge of what was to come. They were not arrested, they were harvested. Dragged down the long, echoing corridors, past the cells of the other inmates who would lie frozen in their bunks, listening to the muffled screams and praying the guards would not stop at their door. The destination for every man captured in this shadow hunt was the same: the deep, lightless maw of the hole. They were thrown into the darkness, one by one, to face a different kind of executioner: the slow, methodical breaking of a man's body, mind, and soul. There was no trial for Frank Heyer, Everett Lilly, or Walter Legg. Their case was closed by the bullets at the North Wagon Gate. But the state of West Virginia still needed its public spectacle of justice. So, a dozen other men, identified by snitches and beaten confessions as the riot's secondary leaders, were shackled and marched into the Marshall County Courthouse. The trial was a grim formality, a play performed for the benefit of the newspapers. The room was a cauldron of silent hatred, with the families of guards on one side of the aisle and the hollow-eyed kin of the inmates on the other, a wooden railing the only thing keeping the two worlds from tearing each other apart. The air was thick with the threat of violence. State police, the same men who had stormed the prison, lined the courtroom walls, their hands resting on their sidearms. They weren't there just to keep order. They were there as a constant, intimidating reminder of the state's power. The key witnesses were inmates, brought in under heavy guard. They shuffled to the stand, their faces pale with terror. You could see the impossible choice in their eyes. If they told the truth and defended their friends, they faced the guards' wrath back at the prison. If they lied for the prosecution, they signed their own death warrant with their fellow convicts. Most mumbled their way through their testimony, a ghost at their own trial. The defendants themselves showed no fear. They sat in their chairs, gaunt and bruised from the weeks of retribution they had already endured, and watched the proceedings with a kind of stony defiance. There was no remorse in their eyes, only a deep, weary contempt for the whole charade. They had made their stand, they had lost, and this was simply the price. They were mountain men, and they would face the state's judgment with the same grim dignity they would face a harsh winter or a mine collapse. They would not beg. The verdict, when it came, was no surprise to anyone. Guilty, on all counts. The judge handed down sentences that were designed to crush what little was left of their lives, adding decades to the time they were already serving. It was a message sent loud and clear. This is what happens when you fight back. The gavel fell, and the law of West Virginia was satisfied. But in the cold, dark cells of Moundsville, the men knew that justice had not been present in that courtroom. Only power. For the families of the men who died at the gate, the verdict was a final, cruel twist of the knife. A name that had once been spoken with pride in the hollows was now a brand, a mark of shame. In the town of Moundsville, to be a Hire or a Lilly was to be the kin of a killer, a cop-napper, a failed revolutionary. They were met with stony silence at the general store, with whispers that stopped the moment they turned a corner. There was no atonement for them, only a curse. Most simply couldn't bear the weight of it. They packed what little they had, and under the cover of darkness, they left the Ohio Valley, dissolving like ghosts into the wider world, hoping to find a place where their name didn't carry the stench of gun smoke and rebellion. For the men who were convicted, life after the verdict was a slow, walking death. Their real sentence wasn't written on paper. It was carved into their skin with every sneer from a guard, every extra hour of hard labor, every denial of a letter from home. They were living warnings, the ghosts of the riot made to walk the tiers as a daily reminder of the price of defiance. They were the first to be blamed for any trouble, the last to receive medical care, and the ones who were always watched. They were condemned to serve their time under the absolute power of the very men they had tried to overthrow, and that power was now absolute, unblinking, and hungry for payback. And what of the state, the warden, the guards? They faced no trial, no verdict. They were the victors. For a short time, the riot forced a sliver of light into the dark corners of Moundsville. Newspapers wrote editorials, and a few state commissions made recommendations. The food might have improved for a few months, and the most brutal beatings might have stopped for a while. But the soul of the place remained unchanged. The riot didn't cleanse the system. It taught it a lesson. It taught the men in charge that they had to be more careful, more total in their control. The community, both inside and outside the walls, began the hard work of forgetting. It was a conscious act of burial. The town of Moundsville buried the shame of having a national scandal erupt in its backyard. The prison buried the memory, because it was a dangerous and contagious thing. The story of the riot was locked away in a file, and on the cell blocks, speaking the names Here or Lilly became an act of suicide. The whole brutal, bloody affair was covered over with a thick, heavy blanket of silence, pushed down into the dark mud of the past, where everyone hoped it would lie quiet forever. The state of West Virginia eventually closed the doors on Moundsville Penitentiary in 1995. But the prison didn't die. It stands there still, a stone skeleton by the Ohio River, its towers casting the same long shadows they did a century ago. The locks are off the doors now. You can buy a ticket and walk the same halls where Here and Lilly made their desperate stand. The prison is a museum now, a tourist attraction, a monument to its own misery. If you go there today, they will take you to the North Wagon Gate. It's still there, a massive wall of iron and rust, and you can stand in the very spot where the state police opened fire. The guides will tell you the official story. But if you look closely at the old stone and steel, you can feel the true echo of that day. It's a scar that never healed, a physical witness to 90 seconds of brutal, overwhelming violence. It's the closest thing we have to a tombstone for a rebellion. You won't find many people with the last name Hire or Lilly in the Moundsville phone book. Their families are long gone, scattered to the winds by shame and sorrow. Their bloodlines were effectively exiled from the valley, their part of the story erased. The descendants of the guards and the townspeople remained, passing down their version of the events, the one where order triumphed over chaos. And so, the story became one-sided, the official report carved into the town's memory, while the dissenters' side faded into an uneasy silence. But something remains. The prison itself seems to have a memory. It's called one of the most haunted places in America, and the 1929 riot is the cornerstone of its dark legend. Tour guides and paranormal investigators will tell you about the phantom screams that still echo from the rotunda, or the dark, menacing figure they call the Shadow Man that stalks the halls. Some claim it's the lingering rage of a rioter, a spirit so consumed by the injustice of his end that he can never leave. The riot didn't just stain the floor with blood, it left a permanent psychic wound on the building itself. People may forget, but stone walls never do. So we come back to the question that has hung in the smoky air for nearly a century, the question that clings to the cold stone of the Moundsville prison like a shroud. Was it justice, or was it murder? The law has its answer, written in a dusty report. 3 armed and dangerous convicts killed while resisting law enforcement. A justifiable, if tragic, end to a violent siege. But in the mountains, where the line between a lawman and a company man has always been blurry, they tell a different story. They say that when you corner desperate men, deny them every peaceful path, and then meet their final defiant stand with an overwhelming volley of gunfire, you're not just enforcing the law. You're putting down a rebellion, and that always looks a lot more like murder. This story is not just about a riot. It's about the simple, terrible truth of what happens when a system is built to break the human spirit. You can take a man's freedom, you can feed him garbage, you can beat him in the dark, but you can never truly take his pride. When you push a man to the point where he has absolutely nothing left to lose, you don't break him. You make him the most dangerous thing on God's green earth. The stand of Here, Lily, and Leg was not an act of criminals seeking escape. It was a raw, bloody scream for dignity from the bottom of a man-made hell. They lost their fight, and the world did its best to forget them. But their story is a warning that echoes down through the years. It reminds us that behind every prison number, there is a human heart, and that even the most broken man will eventually fight back if pushed too far. The ghosts of Moundsville don't just haunt those old stone walls. They haunt us with a lesson that must not be forgotten. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Imagine you are lost, stripped of everything you love, dragged hundreds of miles from your home, and forced to watch as your children are torn from your arms. Now, imagine it's October. The Appalachian winter is closing in like a fist, and your only way home is a 600-mile walk through an untamed wilderness. You have no food, no map, and no weapon but your own will to live. How far would you go to get back? Would you eat tree bark and frozen roots? Would you crawl on frostbitten feet until the bones showed through? And what would you do if the only person with you went mad from hunger and decided you were her next meal? This isn't a Hollywood script. This is the true story of Mary Draper Ingalls, a 23-year-old mother from the edge of the Virginia frontier. Her name isn't as famous as Daniel Boone's, but her journey is one of the most brutal and terrifying survival epics in American history. The official records tell us she escaped captivity and walked home. But the whispers and legends passed down through the generations tell a much darker story, one of starvation, madness, and the absolute limits of human endurance. Today, we're going to follow her bloody footprints back through time and ask a bone-chilling question. What unspeakable things did Mary have to do to survive those 43 days in a frozen hell? Before the screams, there was the quiet work of building a life from scratch. Picture it. The year is 1755, and you're standing in Draper's Meadow, a small settlement on the very edge of the known world. Today, it's near Blacksburg, Virginia, but back then, it was the last stop. Beyond it lay an ocean of trees, a wilderness so vast and ancient, it felt like it could swallow you whole. The mountains weren't just a backdrop, they were a living, breathing entity that watched over the valley. They gave you timber for your home and game for your table, but they also held secrets, and they never let you forget how small you were. This little patch of cleared land was a fragile bubble of civilization, and at its heart were families like the Ingalls and the Drapers. William and Mary Ingalls were young, strong, and filled with the kind of hope that only pioneers can understand. They weren't looking for gold or glory, they were looking for a future. Their days were measured by the sun and the seasons. William's hands were calloused from the axe and the plough, carving a farm out of the forest. Mary, just 23 years old, ran the home, her life a steady rhythm of mending clothes, tending the garden, and raising their two little boys, 4-year-old Thomas and 2-year-old George. And as that summer sun beat down, Mary was heavy with their third child. Every stitch she sewed, every meal she prepared, was an act of faith in a future that seemed to stretch out before them, as promising as the valley itself. They weren't alone in this endeavor. A community is a fortress built of people, and Draper's Meadow was a tight-knit clan. When a new cabin needed to be raised, every man lent his back. When sickness came, the women shared remedies and watched over each other's children. They were bound together by hardship, by faith, and by the shared, unspoken understanding that their survival depended on one another. But beyond their cleared fields, the world was on fire. The French and Indian War wasn't some distant conflict fought by men in red coats. Here, on the frontier, it was a phantom war fought in the shadows. The French, desperate to halt the westward push of the British colonies, had forged alliances with native tribes, including the powerful Shawnee. They armed them, paid them, and pointed them east, urging them to unleash chaos on the remote settlements. Draper's Meadow, isolated and miles from any fort, was a perfect target, a lone candle flickering in a gathering storm. The people of the meadow knew the danger, of course. It was a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their daily lives. Every strange sound from the woods, every rumor that trickled in from the east, was a reminder of their vulnerability. Yet, life had to go on. The corn was growing tall, the harvest needed to be brought in, and a new baby was on the way. They held on to the comforting routines of their existence, praying that the war would remain a distant thunder. They didn't know that the storm was already upon them, and that in a matter of hours, their entire world was about to be washed away in blood. To understand the blood that was spilled in Draper's Meadow, you have to understand the ink that was used to claim the land. That valley wasn't empty when the first settlers arrived. For generations, it had been a thoroughfare, a seasonal hunting ground for the Shawnee and other tribes. It was a part of their world, a land not owned but used, a place woven into the fabric of their memory and their survival. The streams had their names, the mountains held their spirits. Then, men from the east arrived with pieces of paper issued by a distant king that claimed this ancient land was now theirs. The architect of this push into the wilderness was a man named Colonel James Patton. He was an Ulster Scot, tough as a hickory root and driven by a relentless ambition. He'd secured a massive land grant from the British Crown, 100,000 acres, with the mission to settle the Virginia frontier. He was a land speculator, a military man, and a politician. To the colonial government, he was a visionary, building a buffer against the French and their native allies. To families like the Drapers and the Ingalls, he was the man who offered them a dream, a piece of land to call their own, a chance to build something that would last. They were the human bricks in the wall he was building against the wilderness. But this grand vision was built on a foundation of betrayal. Just over a decade earlier, at the Treaty of Lancaster, colonial officials had made a deal with the Iroquois Confederacy, who, in a move of political power, sold off the rights to the Ohio Valley, land they didn't truly control and that the Shawnee considered their own. The Shawnee never signed that treaty. They never agreed to it. In their eyes, every cabin razed, every tree felled, every field plowed in places like Draper's Meadow was an invasion. Colonel Patton's land grant wasn't a legal document to them. It was a declaration of war written on sheepskin. In these mountains, a family name was everything. For the Ingalls and the Drapers, their name was a seed they were planting in new soil, a legacy they hoped would grow into a dynasty of farmers and families. Their identity was tied to the deed in their pocket and the sweat on their brow. But for the Shawnee, a name like Cornstalk carried the weight of ancestors, the sacred duty to protect the hunting grounds that fed their people. Their identity was inseparable from the land itself. So when these two worlds collided, it wasn't just a dispute. It was a clash of destinies. The settlers saw themselves as pioneers taming a savage land. The Shawnee saw themselves as patriots defending their home from invaders. Draper's Meadow was the fault line, and the tremor was about to begin. In a place as isolated as Draper's Meadow, news traveled on foot and was paid for in whispers. Every few weeks, a lone trapper or a circuit rider would appear out of the woods, a ghost from the outside world, and the community would gather to drink in his words like water. But in the summer of 1755, the news they brought was poison. They told stories of homesteads on the Greenbrier River burned to ash, of families vanished from their cabins without a trace. These tales spread through the settlement like a fever, leaving a chill that the summer heat couldn't touch. The names of the Shawnee leaders were no longer abstract. They became specters that haunted the daylight. The settlers spoke of a warrior named Kilbuck, whose ferocity was legendary. And they spoke of a young chief named Cornstalk, a man whose reputation was already growing into myth. They said he was a brilliant strategist, a man who could move his war parties through the dense forest like a silent wind, striking and disappearing before a proper defense could be mounted. He wasn't some distant enemy. He was a neighbor whose land they now occupied, and his grudge was as deep and personal as the valleys themselves. The tension wasn't just based on far-off rumors. It was in the air they breathed. A few months prior, a hunter from a nearby settlement had been found dead by a stream, his rifle gone, his body bearing the unmistakable marks of a tomahawk. It was a clear and brutal message. You are not safe here. The men started carrying their rifles with them even to the fields, and the women kept the children closer to the cabins. Every snapped twig in the woods, every owl's call that sounded just a little too human, sent a jolt of ice through their veins. This constant fear began to fray the edges of their small community. Some whispered that Colonel Patton had been too bold, that his relentless push westward had painted a target on all their backs. Others argued that his was the only way, that to show fear was to invite attack. A quiet suspicion could curdle a lifelong friendship. A glance held a second too long could be mistaken for an accusation. The very silence that had once been a source of peace for these settlers now felt menacing, as if the endless forest was holding its breath, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim what it had lost. And Mary Ingalls felt it all. As a mother with two small boys and another life growing inside her, her senses were sharpened to a razor's edge. She watched her sons, Thomas and George, playing in the dirt near the cabin, their laughter a fragile sound in the heavy, watchful air. She would feel a kick from within her womb, and her hand would instinctively go to her belly, a gesture not just of love, but of a fierce, desperate desire to protect her children from a world that felt like it was closing in, a world where the line between a peaceful home and a slaughterhouse was as thin as a cabin wall. The people of the mountains have always known that the world speaks in signs if you're quiet enough to listen. And on the morning of July 30th, 1755, the signs were all there. They said later that the birds in the forest had fallen silent just before dawn, a heavy, unnatural hush that replaced the usual morning chorus. The air was thick and still, refusing to stir, holding its breath. It was the kind of oppressive quiet that comes before the sky tears open in a storm, a silence that felt heavier than any sound. The human omen arrived on horseback. Colonel James Patton rode into the settlement that morning, his face etched with a gravity that chilled everyone who saw it. He wasn't there for a social call. He was the embodiment of the war, the walking, talking proof that the conflict was no longer a distant rumor. He was there to deliver ammunition and warnings, to speak of organizing the militia, to put a hard edge on the fears that had been whispered in the dark. His presence was meant to be reassuring, a symbol of colonial authority, but it had the opposite effect. It was like planting a lightning rod in the middle of the cabins. He was a magnet for the very violence he was trying to prevent. And Mary felt it. She felt it deep in her bones, a cold dread that coiled in her gut. She was at her sister-in-law Betty Draper's cabin, going through the familiar motions of the day with the other women. But her hands felt clumsy, her mind distant. A wave of profound unease washed over her, so strong it almost made her dizzy. She looked out the cabin door at her sons, Thomas and George, playing near the edge of the woods. In that moment, their small, innocent forms seemed terribly fragile, like ghosts already fading into the deep green shadows. She tried to dismiss the feeling, blaming it on the heat and the weight of her unborn child. But the premonition was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping her heart, whispering that the world as she knew it was about to end. The men of Draper's Meadow were in the fields, their backs bent to the harvest. The rhythmic swing of the scythe, the feel of the sun on their necks. It was the hard, honest work that had defined their lives. They were far enough from the main cabins that the sounds of the settlement were just a faint murmur on the summer air. William Ingalls worked alongside his brother, his mind on the harvest, on the coming winter, on the new baby his wife Mary was due to deliver any day. Suddenly, a sound ripped through the tranquility. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was the unmistakable, terrifying crack of a rifle shot, followed instantly by another, and then a chorus of them. But it was the sound that came next that froze the blood in their veins. A human scream. A woman's scream, high and sharp with pure terror, cut short. Then another, and the chilling war cries of the Shawnee warriors, a sound they had only heard in frightened tales around the fire. William dropped his scythe. For a heart-stopping second, he was paralyzed, his mind refusing to process the horror. Then instinct took over. He and the other men broke into a desperate sprint toward the cabins, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They were farmers, not soldiers. Some had rifles, but they were leaning against a fence line 100 yards away, useless. All they could do was run, fueled by a primal terror and a desperate need to protect their families. They burst through the tree line just in time to see hell itself. Their homes were wreathed in smoke and flame. The Shawnee warriors, their bodies slick with sweat and paint, moved with brutal efficiency. William saw it all in a horrifying slow-motion tableau. He saw Colonel Patton fall, a tomahawk cleaving his skull. He saw his neighbor, Caspar Barger, cut down as he tried to flee. But the image that would be burned into his memory forever was of his wife, Mary. He saw her being dragged from a cabin, her face a mask of shock and terror. He saw his two little boys, Thomas and George, crying, being herded like livestock by the warriors. And he saw his home, the cabin he had built with his own two hands, beginning to burn. He was 100 yards away, unarmed, helpless. To charge forward was suicide. To stay was to witness the end of his world. He could only watch in impotent agony as the raiding party gathered its terrified captives and melted back into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind a scene of carnage, silence, and smoke. The first drops of blood had become a flood, and for the survivors of Draper's Meadow, there was no going back. Inside Betty Draper's cabin, the world was small and safe. The women worked, their movements familiar, the air filled with the quiet sounds of domestic life. Then, the sound came. It wasn't thunder. It was the sharp, flat crack of a rifle, so close it made the floorboards vibrate. Before a single question could be asked, another shot echoed it, and the outside world erupted into a symphony of terror. The cabin door didn't open. It was obliterated, kicked in with a single violent motion. It was as if the forest itself had burst into the room, a whirlwind of painted faces, dark eyes, and the glint of steel. There was no negotiation, no warning. It was a storm of pure, calculated violence. Time seemed to stretch and warp. A minute of chaos felt like an eternity. The air filled with the coppery smell of gunpowder and fear. Betty Draper instinctively clutched her infant child to her chest, a desperate, futile shield of a mother's love. A warrior moved towards her with a terrifying, fluid speed. There was a swift, brutal motion, a blur of action that the mind couldn't properly track, followed by a hollow thud against the cabin's log wall. The infant's desperate cry was instantly and unnervingly silenced. Betty's mouth opened in a scream that made no sound, her arms, suddenly light, falling empty to her sides. Outside, Colonel James Patton, a man who had faced down governors and generals, met his end not in a formal battle, but in his own front yard. He was a pillar of colonial strength, but against the lightning speed of the raid, he was just a man. He managed to draw his sword, a flash of silver in the chaos, but he was overwhelmed in an instant. He fell face down into the very dirt he had fought so hard to claim, his authority dissolving into the bloody earth. Mary saw it all in disconnected flashes of nightmare logic. She saw a painted hand clamp down on her son Thomas' small arm, yanking him forward. She saw George, just a toddler, his face a mask of tears and utter confusion as he was lifted from his feet. Her own body was frozen, trapped between the ferocious instinct to fight for her children and the paralyzing absolute certainty of death. She was no longer a wife or a pioneer, but she was a terrified animal, watching as her young was stolen from the den. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. The screams faded into whimpers, and the sharp crack of gunfire was replaced by the hungry roar and crackle of flames as the cabins began to burn in earnest. This was not a battle, it was a harvest, a human harvest. In the middle of the path, a small corn-husk doll lay face down in the dirt, a solitary, innocent witness to a horror it could not comprehend. The life they had built was gone, reduced to ash and silence in less time than it takes to say a prayer. To us, sitting here centuries later, the men who stormed Draper's Meadow were monsters, pure and simple. But to understand the true horror of that day, you have to do something deeply uncomfortable. You have to try, just for a moment, to see the world through their eyes. In their own minds, they were not criminals. They were soldiers, patriots. They were the righteous hand of vengeance for a people being systematically erased from their own lands. Imagine a young Shawnee warrior, perhaps even Cornstalk himself, lying on a ridge overlooking the settlement the night before. He doesn't see cozy cabins filled with hopeful families. He sees an infection. He sees a scar on the land that his ancestors had hunted for 1,000 years. Every puff of smoke from a settler's chimney is a signal of his people's slow death. Every ring of an axe is the sound of his world being torn apart. The laughter of the children playing in the dirt is the sound of his own children's future being stolen. Their logic was as cold and hard as a river stone. These people are the vanguard of an endless wave that will not stop until the Shawnee way of life is nothing but a memory. They believed that to stop a flood, you must break the dam. The switch didn't flip for them on that July morning. It had been flipped years before, in council houses where they heard of broken treaties and stolen land. The raid on Draper's Meadow wasn't an act of passion. It was a calculated act of war, a political statement written in blood and fire. When a warrior struck down Colonel Patton, he wasn't just killing a man. He was striking down the symbol of the government that had betrayed them. When another committed that unspeakable act against Betty Draper's infant, in his mind, it was a terrifying but logical act of total war. It was a message sent with brutal clarity. We will not just kill your men. We will erase your future. We will burn the memory of you from this land. There is no safe place for you here. After the slaughter, as they melted back into the forest with their terrified captives, there was likely no remorse. There was grim satisfaction. The objective was complete. The enemy outpost was destroyed. The captives were a valuable prize. Women and children could be adopted into the tribe to replace their own people lost to war and disease. The boys, like Thomas and George, were a blank slate, young enough to be molded into Shawnee warriors. Mary, with her skills, was a useful asset. To them, this was not a massacre. It was a successful military operation. They were not filled with a chilling emptiness, but with the grim purpose of a people fighting a desperate war for their very survival. And that, my friends, is a far more terrifying truth than simple, mindless evil. For a long time, no one moved. The surviving men stood frozen at the edge of the tree line, watching the black smoke curl into the indifferent blue sky. The silence that fell over Draper's Meadow was louder than any scream. It was a dead, hollow quiet, punctuated only by the hungry crackle of the fires that were consuming their homes, their past, and their future. Finally, cautiously, William Ingalls and the others began to walk forward, moving like old men into the ruins of their own lives. The scene that met them was one of biblical devastation. The ground was littered with the refuse of the attack, spent wadding from the rifles, a discarded tomahawk, and the bodies of their friends and neighbors. They found Colonel Patton, his silver hair matted with blood. They found Caspar Barger. They found the others who hadn't been fast enough. Every step was a new horror, a new confirmation of the nightmare they had just witnessed. William's heart hammered in his chest as he searched for his family, a desperate, sickening prayer on his lips that he wouldn't find them here, among the dead. He reached the spot where his cabin had stood. It was now just a collapsing skeleton of burning logs. His wife and 2 sons were not there. A wave of something that was part relief and part a deeper, more profound terror washed over him. They weren't dead. They were taken. He sank to his knees in the dirt, the reality of it crashing down on him. Mary, 9 months pregnant. Little Thomas and George, dragged into that endless, hostile wilderness. The image of their terrified faces was a brand on his soul. The other survivors gathered in the smoking clearing, a small, dazed band of broken men. Their shock was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered thought. But as the sun began to dip toward the mountains, shock curdled into a white-hot rage. Philip Barger, seeing his brother's body, grabbed his rifle and swore an oath of vengeance. He wanted to go after them, right now, to plunge into the forest and hunt them down. For a moment, a wild, suicidal energy gripped them all. The primal need to do something was overwhelming. But William Ingalls, his heart shattered, forced himself to think. The Shawnee were expert woodsmen on their own ground. They had a massive head start. To charge blindly into the forest at dusk was not a rescue mission. It was suicide. They were farmers, not trackers. Their grief was a fire, but it would not light their way in the dark. A grim, terrible reason prevailed. They had to get help. As night fell on the smoldering remains of Draper's Meadow, one of the men mounted the least injured horse and galloped east, a messenger of horror, to raise the alarm and summon a posse. For William Ingalls, the hunt had already begun, but it would be a hunt of agonizing patience, of staring into the dark woods and praying for a miracle that felt impossible. The news of the Draper's Meadow massacre traveled faster than any horse. It was a poisoned arrow shot into the heart of the frontier, and it spread a sickness of fear through every isolated cabin and fortified settlement along the New River. The fragile illusion of safety that these pioneers clung to was shattered. If a community as established as Draper's Meadow could be wiped out in broad daylight, then no one was safe. Absolutely no one. In the days that followed, settlers from the surrounding area gathered at the small, palisaded fort that served as the local strongpoint. They came for safety, but they brought their terror with them, and it filled the cramped space like a thick smoke. The community, once a fortress built on mutual reliance, began to crack under the strain. You see, my friends, a tragedy like this doesn't just unite people, It can also tear them apart, exposing the fault lines of fear and self-preservation that run beneath every society. Lines were drawn in the dirt, right there in the muddy courtyard of the fort. On one side were men like Philip Barger, their eyes burning with grief and rage. They demanded immediate bloody retribution. They wanted to form a war party right then and there, ride into the Ohio country and burn every Shawnee village they found. To them, caution was just another word for cowardice. On the other side were the older, more pragmatic men. They understood the futility of such a plan. They argued that a small, vengeful posse charging into the wilderness would be an ant marching into a hornet's nest. It would only lead to more death and leave their own homes defenseless. They urged patience, waiting for the official colonial militia for a proper, organized campaign. And then there was the third group, the largest group of all, the silent. They didn't argue, they didn't make speeches, they just watched with hollow eyes, and at night they would whisper to their wives about packing up and heading back east, back over the mountains where the hand of the law was stronger. The Shawnees' raid had been a brutal act of psychological warfare, and it was working perfectly. It had planted the seeds of terror, and now they were watching them grow, choking out the courage of an entire region. A conspiracy of silence began to take hold. Many knew the trails the Shawnee used. Some had even traded with them before the war. But to share that knowledge, to offer help to William Ingalls, was to mark your own family for the next attack. The fear was a physical presence. People who had been friends for years now avoided each other's gaze. They barred their doors earlier, shushed their children's play, and prayed that the trouble would pass them by. In a handful of cabins, there were small acts of quiet courage. A woman leaving a loaf of bread and a slab of bacon on the doorstep of a family who had lost everything. But these were flickering candles in a vast and encroaching darkness. For William Ingalls, this was a special kind of hell. He had lost his family, and now he was losing his community. He was a man crying for help in a room full of people who were pretending to be deaf. William Ingalls could not wait. The colonial militia was a slow, lumbering beast, and every hour that passed was an hour that took his family deeper into an enemy world. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a husband and father, that he had to go now. A small, grim-faced posse formed around him. This wasn't an army. It was a handful of men bound by grief and rage, his brother John, Philip Barger, who thirsted for vengeance for his own brother, and a few others from the settlement. They were farmers and hunters, not soldiers, armed with long rifles, leather pouches of shot, and a desperate, burning hope. They plunged into the forest, following the trail of chaos left by the Shawnee war party. For the first few days, the trail was brutally clear. The warriors, confident in their head start, had made little effort to hide their tracks. The posse found the campsites, the ashes of small fires still warm. They found discarded items dropped by the captives, a woman's comb, a torn piece of a shirt. Each discovery was a double-edged sword, a spark of hope that they were on the right path, and a fresh stab of pain, a tangible reminder of the terror their loved ones were enduring. William would pick up these small things, his hands trembling, imagining Mary or his sons just hours ahead, just beyond the next ridge. But the Appalachian wilderness is not a neutral ground. It is a fortress of tangled rhododendron, steep ravines, and confusing mist-shrouded peaks. It was a home to the Shawnee and a deadly maze to the settlers. The posse was strong, driven by adrenaline and fury, but the mountains began to wear them down. The easy trail became a phantom. The Shawnee, knowing they were now being pursued, began to use every trick of their ancient craft. They walked for miles in the rocky beds of streams, leaving no footprints. They split their party, creating false trails that led to nowhere, then regrouped miles away. The hunt became an ordeal against nature itself. The men's provisions dwindled. Exhaustion settled into their bones, a cold, heavy weight that even their rage couldn't burn away. They were chasing ghosts. The mountains seemed to swallow the trail whole. One afternoon, after days of grueling pursuit, they came to the edge of a wide, stony creek bed. The tracks, which had been their only physical connection to William's family, simply ceased to exist. They had vanished. The men cast about for hours, wading through the cold water, scanning the opposite bank, but found nothing. The trail was gone. The silence that fell over the small band of men was profound. They stood in the middle of an infinite forest, defeated. The fire of their vengeance had been starved of air, and all that was left was the cold ash of despair. For William Ingalls, this was a moment of absolute soul-crushing failure. He had come so close, but the wilderness had chosen a side, and it was not his. There was no fierce firefight, no dramatic rescue. There was only the quiet, brutal realization that he had lost. The walk back to the ruins of Draper's Meadow was a funeral march. The men who had charged into the woods fueled by a righteous fury now stumbled home, hollowed out by their defeat. William Ingalls had lost his family in the massacre, and now, standing at the edge of that cold stream, he had lost them all over again. He returned not as a rescuer, but as a man condemned to wait and to wonder, a ghost haunting the edge of a wilderness that had swallowed his entire world. And so, my friends, if you're waiting for the part of the story where a sheriff slaps iron cuffs on the guilty men and hauls them before a bewigged judge, I have to tell you that story doesn't exist. There was no grand trial for the warriors who fell upon Draper's Meadow. In the eyes of the colonial government, this wasn't a crime to be prosecuted. It was an act of war. The Shawnee weren't fugitives hiding within the law. They were an enemy nation with its own territory, its own leaders, and its own reasons for fighting. Cornstalk and Kilbuck would never see the inside of a Virginia courtroom. The only justice the law of men could offer was slow, clumsy, and distant. A reward was eventually posted for the return of the captives, a piece of paper that was meaningless hundreds of miles away in the Ohio wilderness. The militia, when it finally mustered, was more concerned with defending against the next raid than avenging the last one. The wheels of colonial justice turned with the speed of a dying glacier, while for the captives, every tick of the clock was an eternity. For William Ingalls, the verdict was clear. The system had failed. The law was a distant abstraction, useless against the immediate brutal reality of his loss. But in the mountains, there is another kind of court, another kind of justice. And in the fall of 1755, Mary Draper Ingalls found herself standing trial in it. Her captors were not on trial, she was. The courtroom was the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Ohio Valley. The judge was the coming winter. The jury was hunger, fear, and exhaustion. The verdict would be simple and final, life or death. While William was hunting shadows in the east, Mary was enduring the verdict of her captors. She had been judged not as a criminal, but as an asset. Her skill with the needle and thread spared her from the brutal gauntlet ritual upon her arrival at Lower Shawneetown. She was put to work, her hands making fine shirts for the very men who had destroyed her world. But this small mercy was a cage within a cage. The true sentence had already been carried out on her family. Her sons, Thomas and George, were judged young enough to be assimilated and were torn from her side, adopted into different families, their pasts to be systematically erased. Her infant daughter, Louisa, was deemed just another mouth to feed and was given away. Mary was now a prisoner, not just of the Shawnee, but of her own bottomless grief. The law of men had abandoned her. The justice of the tribe had shattered her family. In that profound darkness, she came to a realization. If there was any justice to be had, she would have to seize it for herself. It would not be a justice of punishment or revenge. It would be the justice of survival, the justice of reclaiming a life that had been stolen. The Shawnee had passed their sentence on her. Now, she was about to deliver her own. You might think this is where the story finds its happy ending. The hero has returned. The ordeal is over. But for Mary and William Ingalls, the reunion was not an end to the suffering. It was the beginning of a new kind of pain. When William finally held his wife, he was holding a stranger made of skin and bone. her eyes haunted by things he could never understand. The joy of her survival was a fragile light in the crushing darkness of their shared losses. She was alive, but her children were not with her. The verdict of her escape was life, but the price was a lifetime of remembering. They could not go back to Draper's Meadow. The place was a tomb, the very soil poisoned with memories. So they moved on, driven by the pioneers' stubborn refusal to be broken. They settled on the New River, establishing Ingalls Ferry, a vital link that would become a cornerstone of the region. They built a new home, had more children, and tried to stitch together the shredded fabric of a normal life. But a curse followed them. The knowledge that their eldest son, Thomas, was still out there, somewhere in the Ohio country, was a wound that would not heal. And the ghosts of their two youngest, George and their infant daughter Louisa, who they would later learn had both died in captivity, were a constant presence. Mary had survived, but a part of her soul had been left behind in that frozen wilderness, forever wandering. And what of the men who had brought this hell upon them? The wheels of mountain justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. The war raged on for years, a bloody, tangled ledger of raid and reprisal. The Shawnee leader, Cornstalk, would continue to be a formidable adversary to the colonists. But his fate would be a dark mirror of the violence he had unleashed. Years later, in 1777, he would go to an American fort on a mission of peace to warn them of an impending attack by other tribes. Instead of being treated as a diplomat, he was taken hostage. And when a settler was killed nearby, a vengeful mob stormed the fort and murdered the unarmed Cornstalk in cold blood. There was no trial, no judge. It was the same brutal, lawless justice of the frontier that had visited Draper's Meadow, coming full circle. The community itself tried to forget. The name Draper's Meadow was spoken in hushed tones, if at all. The site of the massacre was abandoned, the burned-out cabins slowly reclaimed by the forest, the graves of the dead sinking back into the earth. It became a haunted place, a scar that the land itself was trying to cover over. The survivors scattered, seeking new ground, trying to build lives far from the shadows of that terrible day. The story was not celebrated or memorialized. It was buried. It was a trauma so profound that the only way people knew how to deal with it was to turn their backs and walk away, hoping the silence would eventually smother the screams. But a story this powerful doesn't just fade away into the mist. It leaves echoes. It seeps into the soil and becomes part of the land itself. The most powerful echo, of course, was human. 13 years after the massacre, a treaty was signed and a teenage boy was returned to the Ingalls family. It was Thomas. But the joyful reunion was also a tragedy. He was a ghost from another world. He spoke Shawnee. He had forgotten English, forgotten his parents, forgotten the life he was born into. His reintegration was a long, painful struggle, a living testament to the chasm that had opened up between two worlds. Yet, he endured. The Ingalls family grew, and they never, ever forgot. The story of Mary's ordeal was their founding legend, passed down from parent to child, a sacred inheritance. It was preserved not in dusty history books, but in the living memory of a family, until Mary's own son, John, finally wrote it down, ensuring it would never be lost. And the physical traces are still there, hidden in plain sight. If you go to Blacksburg, Virginia today, you can find the site of Draper's Meadow. It's not a haunted ruin in the woods. It's the heart of the Virginia Tech campus. Thousands of students walk across that land every single day, their minds on exams and their futures. They sit by a quiet duck pond, a memorial to that day, many of them having no idea they are studying on ground that was once soaked in blood and terror. Travel a little further and you'll find the New River. This, to me, is the greatest monument of all. It is the silent, winding witness to her ordeal. It is the same river whose icy water she waded through, whose banks she crawled along in delirious agony. When you stand on its edge, You are standing in the exact footsteps of her 600-mile journey into hell. Its currents still whisper her name. You can even go and stand at her grave in Radford, Virginia, and touch the cold stone that bears her name. It's a tangible link, a direct connection to this woman of impossible courage. People build new lives. They pave roads and raise buildings and try to look forward. But they can never completely erase the past. It's always there, just beneath the surface. The highways and the college campuses can cover the scars, but they can't erase them. The mountains watched it all happen, and the mountains remember. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning around this digital campfire. What unspeakable things did Mary Draper Ingalls have to do to survive? The historical record, the official documents, will never tell you. They can only tell you the distance she walked and the date she returned. But the story she told her son, the story of the old Dutch woman and her descent into madness, that is the only answer we have. Did the woman truly try to kill and eat her? Or was it a terrifying hallucination brought on by starvation, Mary's own mind fracturing under the strain? In the end, my friends, it doesn't matter. The horror was real either way. Mary walked to the absolute zero point of human experience, a place where civilization is stripped away and only the primal will to live remains. The unspeakable thing she did was look into that abyss and find the strength to crawl back out. This is not just a story of survival. It is a story about two kinds of strength. There is the strength of the warrior, the strength to conquer, to take, to destroy. We saw that in the brutal efficiency of the raid. But then there is another kind of strength, a quieter and perhaps more profound kind. It is the strength of the root that holds fast to the earth in a storm. It is the strength of a mother who, having lost everything, decides that her own life is still a testament to the family she loved. Mary Draper Ingalls had that strength. She refused to be erased. Her journey home was an act of defiance, a declaration that even after the fire, after the slaughter, after the loss of her children, she was still here. This is the indomitable Appalachian spirit, forged in the crucible of stories just like this one. It's a story of heartbreak and endurance, of cruelty and unimaginable courage. It reminds us that the foundations of this country were not built on neat treaties and noble ideals alone. They were built on the suffering and the sacrifice of people like Mary, on ground consecrated by blood and tears. Her journey is seared into the very landscape, a lesson that must not be forgotten. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. The first shotgun blast threw her from the saddle into the cold, muddy water of the creek. She was still alive, crawling for the bank, when the second, more brutal blast tore through the air, silencing her forever. The newspapers called her the Bandit Queen, a velvet-clad phantom who rode with the James brothers and ruled the outlaws of the Indian Territory. But the truth was far messier and far more tragic than any dime novel could capture. Who would ambush a woman just 2 days shy of her 41st birthday and leave her to die in the mud? Today, we ride past the legends and the lies to find the real Belle Starr, and to answer the question that still haunts that lonely patch of ground. Who pulled the trigger? Before the gun smoke and the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley, born in 1848 into a world that was anything but lawless. Her home was near Carthage, Missouri, a land of rolling green hills and fertile soil that held a promise of prosperity. Her father, Judge John Shirley, was a man of standing, a prosperous farmer and innkeeper whose family lived a life of relative comfort and respectability. They were slave owners and fierce believers in the Southern cause, their identity deeply woven into the fabric of Missouri's divided soul. This was not a world of desperate poverty that breeds outlaws. The Shirley home was a place of order and aspiration. Young Myra was not raised in a dirt-floored cabin, but was sent to the Carthage Female Academy to receive a classical education. She learned literature, rhetoric, and became an accomplished pianist. You can almost picture it. A dark-haired girl with a stubborn set to her jaw, her fingers flying across the ivory keys, filling the respectable Shirley Inn with music that seemed to hold the roughness of the frontier at bay. She was known to be bright, quick-witted, and possessed of a temper that could flash like heat lightning. She was devoted to her family, particularly to her older brother John, whom everyone called Bud. He was the pride of the family, the embodiment of young Southern manhood, and Myra adored him. In those years, her future likely seemed as clear and orderly as a line of sheet music, a good marriage, a family of her own, a life of influence within her community. But their Missouri was a border state, a land of fault lines and hidden pressures. The very inn where Myra played piano was a crossroads of whispers and arguments. Men passing through spoke of states' rights, of abolitionists, of a nation tearing itself apart at the seams. For the Shirleys, these were not abstract political debates. They were matters of honor, identity, and survival. Every traveler brought news that seemed to darken the sky just a little bit more. The world of Myra Maybelle Shirley, the world of piano lessons, family pride, and Southern gentility, was a fragile one. It was a stately home built on the edge of a volcano. Little did she know that the gathering storm of civil war would not just knock at their door, but blow it clean off its hinges, consuming her brother, destroying her family's fortune, and setting her own feet on a path of rebellion from which she would never turn back. To understand the fire that burned in Belle Starr, you have to understand the land that shaped her. Missouri in the 1850s was not a place of settled peace. It was a powder keg with a short fuse. It was a border state, a place where the deep South culture of the Shirleys, built on land and slaveholding, clashed daily with the free state ideals of their northern neighbors. For families like hers, their property wasn't just soil and buildings. It was a testament to a way of life they believed was righteous, a legacy they would defend with their blood. The Civil War was the spark that ignited that powder keg. This wasn't a conflict of distant armies marching under grand flags. In Missouri, it was a savage, intimate war fought in farmyards and on lonely country roads. It was a war of bushwhackers and jayhawkers, where your neighbor could be your executioner. This was the old scar that would never truly heal, a wound that split communities and families down to the bone. For the Shirleys, there was no question which side they were on. They were Confederates through and through. The weight of the Shirley name now demanded more than just respectability. It demanded action. And it was Myra's beloved brother Bud who would carry that burden into the fight. He didn't join a regular army. He joined a band of Confederate irregulars under the command of the infamous William Quantrill. Riding alongside him were other angry young farm boys whose names would later be written in blood and legend, the James brothers and the Younger Boys. Bud Shirley became a guerrilla, a shadow warrior in a war with no rules. For Myra, this wasn't politics, it was family. Her brother was fighting for their home, for their honor, against an invading force. When Union troops finally caught up with Bud in 1864 and killed him, it wasn't an act of war in her eyes. It was murder. The Union and the entire system of law and government it represented became the sworn enemy of her clan. The feud wasn't with another family over a property line, it was with the United States of America. Her grief hardened into a cold, lifelong vow of defiance. The seeds of the Bandit Queen were planted right there in the blood-soaked soil of Missouri. Long before the war ended, the Shirley Inn had become more than just a resting place for travelers. It was a safe house, a quiet harbor for the Confederacy's most daring and dangerous guerrilla fighters. You have to understand, men like Jesse James and Cole Younger weren't just abstract legends passing through. They were Bud's friends. They were boys Myra knew, young men who sat in her family's parlor, listening to her play the piano while their Colts rested heavy on their hips. Her music was the only moment of peace in their world of ambush and reprisal, and this shared experience forged a bond of loyalty that ran deeper than any law. When the war was lost and the Shirleys were forced to relocate to Syene, Texas, they carried those old loyalties and grudges with them like family heirlooms. They were surrounded by other displaced Southern families, all of them nursing the bitter wound of defeat. In this world, the new Reconstruction-era lawmen weren't seen as protectors. They were seen as occupiers, the enforcers of a victor's justice. A man's worth was judged not by his adherence to this new law, but by his loyalty to the old cause. Whispers travel like wildfire in a place like that, and they clung to Myra Maybelle Shirley. Her association with the younger clan was common knowledge, and the rumors of a youthful romance with the handsome Cole Younger followed her everywhere. It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was the perception. She was marked, seen as part of that defiant, dangerous world. She wasn't just Judge Shirley's educated daughter anymore. She was the girl who kept company with outlaws, a woman who understood their codes and shared their enemies. This web of associations poisoned the air, turning small disagreements into matters of life and death. When Myra fell for Jim Reed, it was no surprise that he was one of their own, another former bushwhacker, a man who knew the taste of battle and had no love for the authorities. Her family objected, seeing in Reed the violence and uncertainty that had already cost them a son. But Myra's defiance was absolute. Marrying him was an act of choosing her side once and for all. The ground was now perfectly fertile for conflict. The community was a tinderbox of Civil War resentments. Myra's own reputation was already stained with the smoke of rebellion, and she had bound her fate to a man who saw the law as an obstacle to be overcome, not a shield to hide behind. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the air was thick with the certainty that trouble wasn't just coming. It was already there, waiting for its moment. The dream of a quiet life died hard under the relentless Texas sun. For a time, Jim Reed tried to beat his past into a plowshare, to work the stubborn soil and be the farmer Myra's family had wanted. But the land held no promise for him, and the quiet life felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. There was a restlessness in him, a hunger for the old thrill, the easy money, and the simple, brutal clarity of a fight. Myra, sharp as she was, saw it in his eyes. She saw the farmer fading and the ghost of the bushwhacker growing stronger with each passing day. The human omen arrived not as a single stranger, but as a clan. They were the Stars, a notorious Cherokee family who lived by their own laws in the wild Indian territory. When they came to visit Jim, it was like a change in the weather. They were men who moved with a different rhythm, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, their hands never straying far from their belts. They spoke in low tones about fast horses, fat cattle that belonged to other men, and lawmen who could be outrun or outgunned. In their presence, Myra could see the change in her husband. The slump of the weary farmer left his shoulders, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator. Their whispers and laughter late into the night sounded like a prophecy of doom to her. This wasn't the rebellion of a Southerner against the Union anymore. This was the siren song of pure outlawry, and Jim was listening with his entire soul. She must have felt a cold dread settle deep in her gut. This was the moment of decision, the fork in the road she could see as plainly as a line in the dust. She had chosen a dangerous man, hoping she could tame him, but now his world was coming to claim him back. Every clink of a whiskey bottle, every quiet cleaning of a revolver was a sign. It was the feeling of standing on a cliff edge, knowing that the man she loved was about to take a step and drag her over it with him. The time for farming was over. The quiet life in Texas didn't just fade away, it was executed. The news didn't arrive as a whisper on the wind, but as a formal warrant carrying the name of Jim Reed. And the charge wasn't for rustling a few head of cattle or running whiskey, it was for murder. A man lay dead, shot down during a dispute over money, and the law said Jim Reed was the one who killed him. The dream of the farm was over, drowned in another man's blood. For Myra, This was the moment the earth opened up beneath her feet. She was standing at a crossroads, and both paths led through hell. One path was to follow the law of the state, the same law that wore the blue uniform of the men who had killed her brother. To follow that path meant turning her back on her husband, the father of her children, and surrendering him to his enemies for judgment. In her world, that wasn't justice, it was the ultimate betrayal. The other path led deeper into the shadows. It meant choosing her clan over the law, loyalty over respectability. It meant accepting that her husband was a killer and deciding to stand by him, to protect him, to become his accomplice. There, in the harsh Texas sunlight, with the wanted poster acting as a death warrant, Myra Maybelle Reed made her choice. She chose blood. She chose her own. Her reaction wasn't fear, but a cold, hard resolve. The anger she had nursed since her brother's death now had a new focus. The law wasn't a faceless entity anymore. It was a hunter, and its prey was her husband. From that moment on, they were no longer just a family struggling to get by. They were fugitives. Every knock on the door, every stranger on the road was a potential threat. The conflict was no longer a matter of old grudges. It was an open war, a daily struggle for survival. The first drops of blood had been spilled, and they had stained her life forever. It happened on a cold February day in 1889, just 2 days before her 41st birthday. She was riding home from a neighbor's house, the path toward Younger's Bend as familiar to her as the lines on her own hand. The air was still, the winter woods quiet. The only sound was the steady rhythm of her horse's hooves on the hard-packed dirt trail. And then, that rhythm was shattered. The sound of the first shotgun blast was a physical thing, a brutal roar that ripped through the silence of the hollow. It echoed off the bare trees and sent a flock of birds screaming into the sky. Her horse, terrified, reared violently, and the saddle was suddenly, unnaturally empty. There was a pause then, just a few seconds that must have felt like an eternity, a moment of agonizing stillness. Then a second, more deliberate blast followed, its report even uglier than the first. And after that, there was only a profound, ringing silence. Later, it was the horse that brought the first news of the tragedy. It came galloping back to the cabin at Younger's Bend, wild-eyed and trembling, the reins tangled, the saddle empty. It was a message of disaster that needed no words. The men who saw it knew instantly that something terrible had happened out on that lonely trail. When they followed the horse's tracks back, they found her. She was lying at the edge of the muddy creek crossing shed, ridden through 1,000 times. The cold, grey water swirled around her, indifferent to the scene. There were no witnesses, only the churned-up mud and the chilling quiet of the woods where an assassin had hidden, waited, and vanished. Her riding habit was stained with the dark, wet earth of the creek bank. The legendary bandit queen, the woman whose name was whispered in fear and admiration from Texas to Arkansas, the friend of the James boys and the wife of Sam Starr, had not gone down in a blaze of glory. There was no grand shootout, no final defiant stand. The air still smelled of spent gunpowder. The only other evidence was the profound and terrible stillness where a life had just been. It was an execution, carried out from the shadows, a cowardly end to a life that had been anything but cowardly. The violence wasn't in the details of the wounds. It was in the deafening silence that was left behind. We will never know for certain who hid in that cold brush, but we can try to crawl inside the mind of a man who would. Let's imagine it was the prime suspect, Edgar Watson, a man with a murder warrant hanging over his head like a noose. In his mind, this wasn't an act of pure evil. It was a simple, brutal calculation. Belle Starr had become a threat to his very existence. She had discovered his secret, the crime he had run so far to escape, and she was about to turn him out. That meant the law would come sniffing around, and his life as a free man would be over. In this twisted logic, Belle wasn't a person anymore. She was a problem, a loose end that needed to be tied off permanently. He saw her not as the legendary bandit queen, but as the one person standing between him and survival. Killing her wasn't an act of passion. It was a business decision, as cold and pragmatic as shooting a lame horse. He was a cornered animal, and in his world, you did whatever it took to break out of the trap. Honor, friendship, decency, those were luxuries a man like him couldn't afford. The switch flipped the moment he realized she would not be bluffed or bought, the moment he looked into her eyes and saw that she was going to act. That was the point of transformation. His anger and fear cooled into a single, sharp point of purpose. The planning would have been methodical. He knew her routines, her paths. He would have chosen the creek crossing deliberately, a place where she would have to slow her horse, where the terrain gave him perfect cover, where the sound of the shot would be muffled by the hollow. He wasn't a raging monster. He was a patient predator setting a trap. And after the second blast tore the air, what did he feel? Not remorse, not triumph. Most likely he felt a profound and chilling sense of relief. The threat was gone. The problem was solved. As he melted back into the brush, his heart would have been beating fast, but not from guilt. It was the adrenaline of survival. His mind would already be working on the next steps. The alibi, the look of surprise on his face when he heard the news. Whether it was the cold calculation of a man like Watson, or the hot, humiliated rage of her own son, the psychology was the same. Belle had become an obstacle, and for the beast in the shadows, obstacles were meant to be removed. When the echoes of the second shot finally died, a heavy, unnatural silence fell over Younger's Bend. The discovery was as grim and undignified as the murder itself. It wasn't a posse of lawmen who found her, but her own people, led to the spot by her riderless horse. They lifted her body from the cold, clinging mud of the creek bank and carried her home. The fearsome bandit queen, the woman who had stared down Judge Parker's court, was gone. All that was left was the mortal remains of Myra Maybelle Starr, her clothes soaked and stained with the earth she had fought so hard to possess. The cabin at Younger's Bend, once a bustling sanctuary for men on the run, became a house of mourning. The whispers of outlaw plots were replaced by the stunned silence of grief. For her daughter, Pearl, the sight of her mother's body was a wound that would never heal. The shock was soon followed by a cold, burning question that settled in the air like smoke. Who had done this? And who among the men and women gathered in that very room knew more than they were saying? The fight for survival was no longer against the law. It was against the secret killer who might be standing right beside them. Word travels fast in the back country, and it wasn't long before the law arrived. Deputy marshals from Fort Smith, Judge Isaac Parker's men, rode into Younger's Bend. They were hard men, accustomed to the violence of the territory, but this was different. This was the murder of the most famous woman in their jurisdiction. They weren't just investigating a crime, they were stepping into the heart of a legend, a place built on a foundation of secrets and lies, where every neighbor had a grudge and every friend had a hidden motive. The investigation began immediately, a slow, methodical process of untangling the web of Belle's complicated life. Who were her enemies? Who owed her money? Who feared her? The list was dangerously long. A reward was posted, a paltry sum that seemed an insult to the scale of her fame. But in a land where loyalty was cheap and life was cheaper, even a small reward could be enough to loosen a tongue or point a finger. The initial chaos of rumor soon began to crystallize around one name. In the fearful whispers of neighbors and the cold calculations of the deputies, the name of Edgar Watson surfaced again and again. The tenant farmer with a secret past, the man Belle was about to evict. He had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he had the cold-blooded history. The hunt for Belle Starr's killer now had a face and a name. Belle Starr's murder was like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of fear and suspicion spread through every isolated cabin in the territory. This wasn't a tight-knit community bound by friendship. It was a loose collection of families, fugitives, and farmers, all held together by a fragile web of convenience and mutual distrust. Her death tore that web to pieces. Instantly, invisible lines were drawn in the dirt. On one side were those loyal to Belle's memory, her family, the outlaws she had sheltered, and the neighbors who had, in their own way, respected her power. On the other side were those who had feared her, owed her money, or, like Edgar Watson, felt the sting of her wrath. When the marshals from Fort Smith began their investigation, they ran headlong into a solid wall of silence. You have to understand, in the Indian Territory, the law of Judge Parker was seen as a foreign power. The real law was the local code, and that code had one simple rule: you don't talk to outsiders. To be a snitch was a death sentence, far more certain than any verdict from a jury in Fort Smith. The deputies would ask questions, and in return they would get blank stares, shrugged shoulders, and the maddeningly simple phrase, "Don't know nothing." This wasn't just loyalty to the outlaw way, it was raw, paralyzing fear. The killer was still out there. He could be the man plowing the next field over. He could be listening from the shadows at the general store. To speak a name aloud to a lawman was to invite a shotgun blast in the dark for you and your family. People who once left their doors unbarred now checked them twice. A strange horseman on the road was no longer a traveler, but a potential threat. The law offered a reward, but the killer offered a much more immediate consequence. In this atmosphere of terror, even the smallest actions became profound statements of allegiance. True courage was rare, and it was quiet. It was the neighbor woman who left a basket of cornbread on Pearl's doorstep, a silent offering of sympathy that said, "I am with you," without speaking a word. Cowardice, however, was far more common. It was the man who, when asked about Edgar Watson's whereabouts on that fateful afternoon, suddenly found a fascinating spot on the floor to stare at. It was the providing of a vague alibi, the convenient lapse in memory, the turning of a blind eye. Every person in that hollow was forced to make a choice, and most chose the side of self-preservation, burying the truth under a thick blanket of silence. The hunt for Edgar Watson wasn't a grand, sweeping posse of righteous lawmen. It was two separate hunts, running on parallel tracks of justice and revenge. On one track were the U.S. deputy marshals, methodical and official, working for Judge Parker's court. On the other, far more dangerous track, was an unofficial posse, a ghost-like band led by Belle's new husband, Jim July Starr, and likely composed of men who had called Younger's Bend a safe haven. The lawmen wanted Watson in handcuffs. Jim July and his riders wanted him in a shallow grave. The Indian Territory in winter is a merciless landscape. It's not the soaring peaks of Appalachia, but a tangled, brutal world of its own, a maze of dense thickets, frozen swamps, and red clay mud that can suck a horse down to its belly. Watson knew this land. He was a creature of its shadows. He melted into the landscape, his trail as slippery as a water moccasin in a dark creek. For days, the hunt was a frustrating ordeal against nature itself. The marshals followed procedure, while Jim July's men followed instinct, their eyes reading the land for broken twigs and disturbed leaves that the official lawmen missed. Watson was a phantom. A farmer would report seeing a man matching his description near the Poto River, but by the time the posse arrived, he was gone, leaving nothing but a cold campfire. They were always one step behind, chasing a ghost through a wilderness that seemed designed to protect its own. The territory itself was his greatest ally. It was a place where a man on the run could find a sympathetic ear, a hot meal, and a fresh horse from someone who held their own grudge against the law at Fort Smith. Watson wasn't just one man against a posse. He was a fugitive plugged into the lawless network that thrived in those hills. The chase stretched on, the days turning into a week. The pursuers grew weary, their supplies dwindling, their frustration mounting. They were hunting in a land of whispers and lies, where the very air seemed to conspire against them. It felt less like a manhunt and more like an exorcism, trying to drive a malevolent spirit out of a haunted land. Every cold night spent by a fire was a reminder that their quarry was out there, just as cold, just as determined, and driven by the most powerful engine of all, the will to survive. The end came not with a roar, but with a quiet click. It wasn't in a desperate firefight on a windswept ridge. The U.S. Marshals, relentless in their pursuit, finally cornered him. Perhaps it was a tip from someone who decided the reward money was worth more than the risk, or perhaps Watson simply made a mistake. They found him holed up, exhausted, hungry, and out of options. There was no final, defiant stand. Faced with the unwavering steel of the law, Edgar Watson surrendered. The hunt in the shadows was over, but the fight for what passed for justice in that wild country was only just beginning. The air in the Fort Smith federal courtroom was thick enough to taste, a stale mix of sweat, wet wool, and cheap tobacco. This was the domain of the hanging judge, Isaac Parker, a place where the law of the United States finally sank its teeth into the wild frontier of the Indian Territory. The trial of Edgar Watson for the murder of Belle Starr was a sensation. The public gallery was packed to the rafters with a curious and volatile mix. Sober-faced townsfolk, hard-eyed riders from the territory who watched everything with unnerving stillness, and a pack of slick reporters from the eastern papers, pencils flying, hungry for every sordid detail. Edgar Watson sat beside his lawyer, a picture of calm defiance. He wasn't a cornered, terrified animal anymore. He was clean-shaven and wore a borrowed suit, and he surveyed the courtroom with an almost imperceptible smirk. He knew the rules of this game better than any lawyer. His innocence or guilt would not be decided by facts, but by fear. He understood the code of the hills, and he was betting his life on it. The prosecution laid out its case, a carefully constructed web of circumstantial evidence. They had the motive. Belle was about to evict him, exposing him as a wanted murderer from Florida. They had the opportunity. He had no solid alibi for the time of the killing. What they didn't have was a single, credible witness. One by one, Belle's neighbors were called to the stand, and one by one, the wall of silence went up. Men who had spoken freely of their suspicions to the marshals now suffered from a crippling loss of memory. Their eyes would shift, their voices would drop to a mumble, their answers becoming a litany of, "I can't rightly say," and it was too dark to see. You can just imagine the prosecutor's mounting frustration as he watched his case dissolve under the silent, powerful gaze Watson directed at each person who took the stand. The most powerful person in that room wasn't the judge. It was the defendant. He held the lives and fears of the witnesses in his hands, and everyone knew it. They were 100 miles from their isolated cabins, but the threat felt as close as the man in the witness box. The jury was out for less than an hour. The law required them to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, and with only whispers and motive, there was doubt everywhere. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and refused to look at Watson as he read the verdict. Not guilty. A wave of murmurs and gasps swept the room. Edgar Watson simply nodded, as if he had known the outcome all along. He stood up, a free man in the eyes of the law, and walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. But as he passed through the crowd, a local legend says he came face to face with Belle's daughter, Pearl. Someone asked her then and there who she thought had killed her mother. Pearl, it is said, never took her eyes off Watson as she replied, her voice cold and clear, "I know who killed my mother, and so does Mr. Watson." The court of men had spoken, but out on the courthouse steps, the justice of the mountains had delivered its own chilling verdict. The verdict was a second shotgun blast, this one fired into the heart of Belle's family. For her daughter Pearl, the acquittal of Edgar Watson was an impossible betrayal. The law had failed, and the man she believed was her mother's murderer was now free to walk the same earth. She and her brother Ed were now adrift, the anchor of their chaotic world gone. They stayed at Younger's Bend for a time, trying to hold on to the last piece of their mother's legacy, but the place was haunted. Every shadow in the woods, every creak of the cabin door was a reminder of the murder and the injustice. Eventually, the weight became too much. They drifted away, their lives following a long, sad arc away from the violence of their upbringing, seeking a peace they would never fully find. As for Edgar Watson, he left Fort Smith a free man, but he was a marked man. The court's verdict meant nothing in the territory, where Bell's friends and family held their own silent court. He knew he could never return to his farm, so he fled, becoming a wanderer, drifting from state to state, always looking over his shoulder. He couldn't escape the shadow of the bandit queen. For years, he was a ghost, haunted by the murder he was never convicted of. The law had acquitted him, but the court of public opinion and rumor had found him guilty. His ultimate fate is a matter of legend itself, but many say he met his end years later in another squalid dispute, his life ending as violently as the one he was accused of taking. It was a different kind of justice, slow and patient, but just as final. The community around Younger's Bend tried to forget. Forgetting was a form of self-preservation. To speak of Belle Starr's murder was to stir up ghosts and invite trouble. The story was pushed down, buried under the routines of farming and the passing of seasons. The notorious cabin at Younger's Bend, the outlaw sanctuary, slowly fell into disrepair, its timbers rotting, its stories fading into the landscape. The territory was changing. The old outlaw days were dying, and the people who lived there wanted to look forward, not back. The story became a cautionary tale whispered to children, a wild piece of local folklore. They buried the truth under a conspiracy of silence, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for peace. But burying a story like that is like burying a seed. It doesn't die. It just waits in the darkness, ready to sprout again when someone comes along and starts digging. The name Starr didn't simply vanish into the red dirt of the territory. It echoed on, carried by her children, whose lives were forever shaped by their mother's violent end. Her son, Ed Reed, continued a life of petty crime, a pale shadow of the outlaws his mother had known, until he was killed in a saloon argument. Her daughter, Pearl, took a different path. She tried to escape the legacy, but found that the only way to survive was on the fringes of the very society that had sensationalized her mother's life. She eventually settled in Fort Smith and ran a bordello, becoming a different kind of outlaw queen, one who provided a haven not for gunslingers, but for the lonely and the lost. The most tangible trace of Belle Starr is a lonely patch of ground near the Eufaula Lake in modern-day Oklahoma, not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. There lies her grave. For years it was marked by a headstone said to have been carved by her daughter Pearl, bearing a bell, a star, and a poignant poem. Shed not for her the bitter tear, nor give the heart to vain regret. 'Tis but the casket that lies here, the gem that filled it sparkles yet. It was a daughter's attempt to reclaim the memory of her mother, to see the gem instead of the gun smoke. But even in death, the legend wouldn't let the woman rest. Over the decades, Belle Starr's grave was desecrated, plundered by treasure hunters possessed by the dime novel lies. They came searching for the twin Colt pistols they believed were buried with her, for jewels, for anything to connect them to the myth. In 1930, ghouls stole the headstone itself. Later, they even stole what was believed to be her skull. The woman's story was consumed by her own legend, her final resting place picked apart by the very sensationalism that had created her. Today, the cabin at Younger's Bend has long since rotted back into the earth. The courthouse in Fort Smith has been preserved as a museum, its walls no longer echoing with the whispers of her trial. Most of the people who live on that land now only know her name from a road sign or a local festival. But the land remembers. The wind that whispers through the blackjack oaks still carries the story. Though the people and the buildings are gone, the spirit of that violent, defiant, and tragic life remains, a permanent echo in the soil of Oklahoma. So we come back to that cold, muddy creek, and the question that still hangs in the air like winter mist: who pulled the trigger? The law books will tell you the case is unsolved, the killer never brought to justice. But the truth, as it so often does in those hills, lies in the whispers that the court refused to hear. The real killer was likely not some romantic, spurned outlaw, but a desperate man with a dark secret, ending a squalid dispute with a blast of buckshot. A pathetic, cowardly end to a life that was anything but. But perhaps the greatest lesson from this saga isn't about solving a murder. It's about how a real person, made of flesh, blood, and contradictions, can be consumed by the legend created for her. Belle Starr was not the mastermind, the velvet-clad rider leading gangs into battle. She was a woman forged in the crucible of civil war, a survivor who used her wits and her connections to build a life in a violent world dominated by violent men. She was a haven, a negotiator, a mother, and a formidable enemy. The true tragedy of Belle Starr isn't found in the manner of her death, but in the theft of her life by the myth that outlived her. This is a story of the untamable, often brutal spirit of the American frontier, and of the sensationalist press that turned real people's pain into cheap entertainment. The newspapers and dime novels gave the world a bandit queen, but in doing so, they erased the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, who lived, bled, and died in the mud of the Indian Territory. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. When I say the name Fred Rogers, a specific image floods your mind. You see a red cardigan being zipped up, you see sneakers being tied, you see a gentle smile, and you hear a soft piano melody that makes you feel safe. For 50 years, that name has been synonymous with kindness. It represents a man who taught generations of American children that they were special and that they were loved. It is perhaps the most trusted name in the history of television. But in 1957, in the deep, mist-covered hollows of West Virginia, that name did not mean safety. It did not mean comfort. And it certainly didn't mean it was a beautiful day in the neighborhood. In Fayette County, when people whispered the name Fred Rogers, they didn't smile. They locked their doors. They checked the shotgun behind the frame. Because the Fred Rogers of this story wasn't interested in being your neighbor. He was interested in hunting you. This is not the story of a children's show host. This is the story of a man who walked the same earth at the same time, carrying the same name, but living in a completely different moral universe. While one Fred Rogers was building a land of make-believe, the other was building a very real house of horrors. A place so disturbing that the locals, tough, hardened coal miners and mountain men who had seen everything, couldn't bring themselves to call him a man at all. They called him the Beast Man. To understand how this happened, we have to strip away our modern comforts. We have to go back to a time before smartphones, before DNA profiling, and before the term serial killer even existed. We are going to 1950s Appalachia. Picture a world of steep green mountains that act like walls, cutting you off from the rest of civilization. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, but also of profound isolation. In the 50s, the interstate highway system hadn't yet sliced through these hills. Roads were dirt and gravel. Houses were miles apart, hidden behind thick curtains of oak and pine. If you screamed in a city, someone might hear you. If you screamed here, the sound would just travel up the valley and dissolve into the fog. In this world, survival depended on trust. You had to trust your neighbor because he was the only one who could pull your truck out of the mud or help you fix your barn roof. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, but a neighbor was sacred. And that is exactly what Fred Rogers counted on. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a shadow in the alley. He was a member of the community. He was the polite man who waved at you from his porch. He was the man who might offer an elderly woman a ride to the grocery store or help a widow with her taxes. He understood the social fabric of the American South perfectly. He knew that if you wore a suit, spoke softly, and smiled at the right time, you became invisible. We often think of monsters as chaotic, messy creatures. We imagine them lurking in the dark, frantic and wild. But the most dangerous predators in history are the ones who have learned to mimic human behavior. They are the chameleons. They stand in line with us at the bank. They sit in the pew behind us at church. They look like us. Fred Rogers was the ultimate chameleon. He crafted a persona of a successful, charming businessman. He projected an image of stability that attracted exactly the kind of people he was looking for. The lonely, the vulnerable, the people who were just looking for a connection in a world that felt like it was moving too fast. But beneath that carefully ironed suit was a mind that didn't process human emotion like yours or mine. Where you see a person, he saw an object. Where you feel empathy, he felt opportunity. And where you see a home, he saw a hunting ground. To truly grasp the scale of what happened, you need to understand the stage upon which this tragedy played out. West Virginia is often called the Mountain State, but that name doesn't quite do it justice. These aren't just mountains. They are ancient, eroded walls that create a labyrinth of valleys, ridges, and hollows, or as the locals say, hollers. In the 1950s, a holler was more than just a geographical feature. It was a world unto itself. You could live your entire life in one valley and barely know the people 3 ridges over. The communities here were tight-knit, bound by blood and the coal dust that covered everything. But they were also intensely private. The unwritten rule of the mountains was simple. You mind your business, and I'll mind mine. Imagine driving down a road that isn't on any map. The canopy of trees overhead is so thick, it blocks out the midday sun. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. There are no streetlights, no cell towers, no surveillance cameras, just miles and miles of winding gravel tracks that often dead-end at a solitary house. It was the perfect environment for a predator. In a modern city, you are constantly being watched. Witnesses, cameras, digital footprints. But here, a man could disappear. Or worse, he could make someone else disappear. The police presence in these rural counties was minimal. A sheriff might have 3 or 4 deputies covering an area of 500 square miles. They didn't have the manpower to patrol every back road. They relied on reports. They relied on people noticing that something was wrong. But what happens when the person who goes missing has no one to notice? This isolation created a unique kind of vulnerability. We often think of the 1950s as the golden age of American community, where doors were left unlocked and everyone knew everyone. That was true in the suburbs of New York or Chicago. But in the remote corners of Appalachia, isolation was a double-edged sword. It offered freedom, yes, but it also offered silence. In these hills, if you scream, the only thing that answers back is the echo, and sometimes not even that. The geography acted as an accomplice. If you wanted to hide something in a city, you had to be clever. If you wanted to hide something here, you just had to walk 100 yards into the woods. The forest floor, with its deep layers of foliage and shifting soil, could swallow a secret in an afternoon. Into this landscape walked Fred Rogers. He wasn't a mountain man by birth, but he understood the utility of the terrain. He saw the hollers not as a place of beauty, but as a place of concealment. He realized that the privacy the locals cherished so much could be weaponized against them. He chose his location carefully. A house that was respectable enough to invite guests into, but isolated enough that no one could hear what happened after the door closed. A place where the nearest neighbor was just far enough away to see the lights on, but too far away to hear a cry for help. The house he eventually occupied became a fortress of solitude. To the casual observer driving past, it was just another quiet home in a quiet state. A place where a man might retire to read books and listen to the radio. But the geography allowed him to control his environment completely. He controlled who came in. He controlled who went out. And most importantly, he controlled the narrative. If you were casting a movie about a serial killer in the 1950s, you would probably look for someone with a sharp, sinister face, someone with cold eyes and a nervous twitch. You would want the audience to know, the moment he stepped on screen, that this was the bad guy. Fred Rogers would never have been cast in that role. In person, Rogers was disarmingly ordinary. He was a heavy-set man, soft around the middle, with a face that seemed permanently etched with a grandfatherly concern. He wore thick-rimmed glasses that gave him an air of intelligence and harmlessness. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like the guy who taught Sunday school or the accountant who handled the church finances. He dressed the part too. In a region where denim overalls and coal-stained work boots were the uniform of the day, Rogers was always impeccable. He wore suits. He wore ties. His shirts were starched. He smelled of cheap but pleasant cologne and tobacco. To the people of West Virginia, this attire signaled one thing: respectability. He presented himself as a man of means, a retired civil engineer or perhaps a businessman looking for a quiet place to settle down after a life of hard work. He spoke with a confidence that suggested he knew things others didn't. When he walked into the local general store, the conversation didn't stop in fear. It stopped in deference. But this persona was a complete fabrication. It was a costume. The real Fred Rogers was a career criminal, but not a violent one, at least, not initially. He was a grifter, a con artist. He had spent years drifting through the cracks of American society, learning the art of the lie. He knew that people see what they want to see. If you act like you belong, people assume you do. If you act like you have money, people assume you are rich. He had learned a crucial lesson early in his life of crime. Violence attracts attention, but persuasion is invisible. If you rob a bank, the police come looking. But if you talk someone into giving you their life savings, they might be too embarrassed to ever report it. Rogers was a master of reading human needs. He could look at a person and see exactly what was missing from their life. For the men in the community, he offered camaraderie and stories of the outside world. For the women, he offered something far more dangerous: hope. He wasn't a young man. By the time he arrived in West Virginia, he was in his late 50s. This age was his greatest camouflage. We are conditioned to view the elderly as harmless. We hold doors open for them. We trust them with our children. We assume that the fire of aggression burns out with age. Rogers used this bias like a skeleton key. Who would suspect the chubby, bespectacled old man of doing anything worse than cheating at cards? And he realized that in the vast, lonely expanse of America, he didn't need to hunt with a gun. He found a weapon that was far more effective, silent, and reached much further than any bullet. He picked up a pen. In the era before dating apps and instant messaging, the search for love was a slow, deliberate process. For millions of Americans in the 1950s, especially those who were widowed, divorced, or simply left behind by the post-war baby boom, loneliness was a quiet epidemic. To cure this, many turned to Lonely Hearts Clubs. These were magazines and newspapers dedicated to connecting singles across the country. You would send in a photo and a short biography, pay a small fee, and your profile would be printed alongside hundreds of others. It was the Tinder of the atomic age, but infinitely slower, and as it turned out, infinitely more dangerous. For Fred Rogers, these magazines were not a path to romance. They were a catalogue. He didn't just browse them, he studied them. He looked for specific keywords: widow, savings, homeowner, no children. He was filtering for vulnerability. He was looking for women who had assets but no protectors, women who were desperate enough to travel to a stranger and isolated enough that no one would immediately come looking for them. Once he identified a target, the seduction began. But it didn't happen in person. It happened on paper. Rogers was a prolific writer. His letters were masterpieces of manipulation. He didn't come on too strong. He didn't sound desperate. He sounded like a kindred spirit. He would write about his own loneliness, a lie, his comfortable retirement, a lie, and his desire for a companion to share his golden years, the biggest lie of all. He spun a fantasy that was irresistible to a woman sitting alone in a small apartment in Ohio or Pennsylvania. He described the beautiful West Virginia hills. He described his large, empty house that just needed a woman's touch to make it a home. He painted a picture of a peaceful, secure future. For a woman struggling with financial insecurity or the fear of dying alone, these letters were a lifeline. Rogers was offering them an escape hatch. But behind the poetic language was a cold, mathematical calculation. Rogers was essentially running a business. The commodity was human life, and the profit margin was whatever was in their bank account. The trap snapped shut when he popped the question. Not necessarily marriage right away, but a visit. "Come see the house," he would write. "Bring your things. If you like it, we can build a life together." He often advised them to sell their property before coming. "Why keep that old house?" he would suggest gently. "Bring the cash. We can put it into a joint account. We'll start fresh." It sounds obvious to us now. The red flags are blinding, but you have to put yourself in their shoes. These were women who had been invisible for years. Suddenly, a charming, successful man is paying them attention. He wants them. He is offering them a fairy tale ending. The desire to believe is a powerful drug. And so, they came. They packed their suitcases. They withdrew their life savings. They boarded trains and buses. They thought they were traveling toward a new beginning. In reality, they were delivering themselves and their money directly to the butcher's door. Let's follow one of these stories to see how the trap actually worked. Imagine a woman named Celia. She's in her late 50s. She's a widow. Her children have grown up and moved away. Her house feels too big, too quiet. The silence in the evening is deafening. Then she meets Fred Rogers on paper. For 3 months they exchange letters. His handwriting is neat, his tone respectful. By the 4th month, Celia is in love. Not necessarily with the man, but with the idea of him. With the idea of being needed again. He suggests she come for a visit. Just to see, he says. No pressure. But he adds a practical note. If you do decide to stay, it would be a shame to have to go all the way back to sell your things. Why not liquidate now? Bring the cash. Banks are so impersonal, and out here in the country, cash is king. She sells her furniture. She closes her bank account. She sews the cash into the lining of her coat or hides it deep in her purse, feeling a thrill of excitement she hasn't felt in decades. She takes a Greyhound bus. The landscape changes from the flat plains or the crowded city streets to the rolling green hills of Appalachia. The roads get narrower. The towns get smaller. When she arrives at the station, he is there waiting. He looks exactly like his picture. He is smiling. He takes her heavy suitcase, the one containing everything she owns in the world. He opens the car door for her. "Welcome home," he says. The drive to the house is long. They leave the main road, then the paved road, then the gravel road. The trees close in. The nearest house was passed miles ago. A flicker of doubt might cross her mind now. It's very isolated. It's very quiet. When they pull up to the house, it looks normal. A 2-story structure, maybe a bit weathered but solid. She steps inside. She expects a warm embrace, a cup of tea, a celebration of their new life. And for the first few days, that's exactly what she gets. This was the most cruel part of Rogers' game. He didn't strike immediately. He played the role of the gracious host. He cooked for them. He walked with them in the woods. He let them feel safe. He was waiting. He was waiting for the check to clear. He was waiting for her to write that final letter to her family saying, "I've arrived safely. I'm so happy. I'll write again soon." That letter was crucial. It bought him time. It assured the outside world that everything was fine. Once that letter was in the mailbox, the atmosphere in the house would shift. Subtle at first. A cold look. A snapped command. The charming suitor began to dissolve, revealing the controller underneath. Celia might have noticed he was locking the doors from the inside. She might have noticed he was spending a lot of time in the basement, hammering, building something. But the dream house was rapidly becoming a cage, and the man she thought was her savior was about to become her jailer. The transition from guest to prisoner didn't happen with a bang. There were no bars on the windows, at least not visible ones. The prison Fred Rogers built was psychological first, physical second. Imagine the confusion. You are in a strange house miles from civilization with a man you thought you loved. When his behavior changes, your first instinct isn't to run, it's to fix it. You think, did I do something wrong? You try harder to please him. This is the cycle of abuse compressed into a terrifyingly short timeline. Rogers knew that a confused victim is a paralyzed victim. He would start by cutting the lines of communication. The phone is acting up, he'd say. Or, let's just enjoy our privacy for a while. Inside the house, the walls began to close in. The isolation of the holler, once romantic, became oppressive. Rogers would begin to extract information. Where exactly is the rest of the money? Are there any other bank accounts? Who else knows you are here? He did this casually, over dinner, but his eyes were hard. He was taking inventory. He needed to be sure that when she disappeared, no one would have a reason to come looking immediately. We have evidence that some victims lived in the house for weeks before the end came. Weeks of walking on eggshells. Weeks of sleeping in a bed that felt increasingly like a coffin. One can only imagine the moment of realization. The moment when the nice old man mask slipped completely. Maybe she found something she wasn't supposed to see. A piece of jewelry that didn't belong to her. A dress in a size she didn't wear. Or maybe she just saw it in his eyes. The look of a predator who is done playing with his food. She wrote to her sister that she had found paradise. She didn't know she was digging her own grave in the backyard, because that is what was happening. While she was inside, worrying about his mood, Rogers was outside, preparing the disposal site. He was methodical. He dug holes. He prepared chemicals. He sharpened tools. The terror of this situation is the helplessness. Even if she wanted to run, where would she go? She is in the middle of the Appalachian wilderness. She has no car. She likely has no money, as she has already given it to him for safekeeping. And Rogers was always watching. But the end was inevitable. Rogers ran his house like a conveyor belt. He couldn't have the old victim cluttering up the space when he was already writing letters to the next one. He needed the room. He needed the bed empty. The murder itself wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a heated argument that got out of hand. It was a chore. It was the final item on a checklist. Get the money, secure the deed, kill the woman, clean the house, repeat. And the most chilling part? While this horror movie was playing out inside the walls, life outside went on as normal. The mailman delivered the post. The sun rose and set over the mountains, and Fred Rogers, the monster of the holler, continued to wave at his neighbors. We often comfort ourselves with the idea that evil is obvious. We want to believe that if a man was butchering people in his basement, he would walk around with a dark cloud over his head. But Fred Rogers destroyed that comfort. He wasn't the outcast. He was the pillar. While he was actively murdering women and disposing of their bodies, he was also attending the local church every Sunday. He sang the hymns. He put money in the collection plate, money that, in all likelihood, he had just peeled from the cold fingers of a dead woman. He was a member of the community in good standing. Neighbors described him as soft-spoken and gentle. One neighbor recounted how Rogers would stop by to discuss gardening tips. Another remembered him bringing over a pie. Imagine that, eating a slice of pie baked by hands that had just dismembered a human body. This is the uncanny valley of real life. It's the dissonance that makes your skin crawl. How can a man compartmentalize his mind so completely? How can he switch from beast to neighbor in the span of a door opening? He was particularly good with children. He would wave to them as they played. He gave them candy. To the kids in the holler, he was just Mr. Rogers up the hill. The parents trusted him. In a tight-knit community, that trust is currency. And Rogers was rich. He used this social camouflage to deflect suspicion. If someone saw smoke rising from his property at odd hours, they didn't think, he's burning evidence. They thought, Fred is clearing brush. If they saw him digging, they didn't think, he's digging a grave. They thought, Fred is putting in a new septic line. There is a story of a local man who actually helped Rogers move some heavy trunks. The man joked, "What do you have in here, Fred? Bodies?" Rogers just laughed, a warm, throaty chuckle. "Just old books and papers," he said. "Heavy memories." The neighbor laughed too. They shared a moment of connection over the heavy trunk. A trunk that, we now know, likely contained the dismembered remains of a Lonely Hearts victim. That neighbor lived with that memory for the rest of his life. The realization that he had literally helped the monster hide his crimes, that he had looked the devil in the eye and shared a joke with him. He was so confident in his mask that he became arrogant. He believed he was smarter than everyone in the holler. He believed that these simple mountain folk would never catch on to a sophisticated man like him. He thought he was invincible. He thought he could keep this conveyor belt of death running forever. But arrogance is a blinder. When you look down on people, you stop noticing that they are watching you. You stop being careful, and even the most meticulous spider eventually trips on his own web. The perfect crime is a myth. You can be careful, you can be smart, but you cannot control the universe. Chaos always introduces a variable you didn't account for. For Fred Rogers, the variable was greed. He was getting faster. The gaps between victims were shortening. He was becoming addicted not just to the money, but to the process. And when you speed up, you get sloppy. It wasn't a fingerprint that gave him away. It wasn't a witness who saw a murder. It was something much more mundane. It was a taxi driver. Rogers had been bringing women to the house, but he had to get them there somehow. Usually he picked them up. But as he got busier, or perhaps lazier, he started using local taxi services to transport victims from the train station to his isolated home. In a big city, a taxi driver sees 1,000 faces a day. They don't remember you. In rural West Virginia, a taxi driver remembers everyone, especially a stranger. Especially a woman dressed in city clothes, carrying all her luggage, looking for the Rogers place. People started to talk. "Hey, did you see that lady go up to Fred's house last week? Whatever happened to her? I haven't seen her since." But the real breaking point came from outside the holler. Rogers had killed a woman and, as usual, forged a letter to her family to buy time. But he made a mistake. He didn't know the family dynamic well enough. The tone was wrong. The handwriting was slightly off. Or perhaps the victim had a specific nickname for her sister that Rogers didn't use. The sister didn't buy it. She didn't just shrug and move on. She got on a train. She came to West Virginia looking for answers. She went to the police. At first, the local sheriff was skeptical. "Fred Rogers? The nice old man on the hill? You must be mistaken, ma'am." But she was persistent. She had the letters. She had the dates. She demanded they look into it. Reluctantly, the police decided to pay a visit. Just a welfare check. Just to ask a few questions and clear everything up. Rogers thought he had cleaned up everything, but he forgot one small, insignificant piece of paper. A receipt, a train ticket stub. We don't know for sure what the initial trigger was, but we know that when the pressure applied, cracks appeared in his story. He told the police the woman had visited but left weeks ago. She went back to her husband. He lied smoothly. She took a bus to Chicago, but the police checked the bus station. No one had seen her. They checked the train station. No ticket was purchased. The net was tightening. The discrepancies were piling up. The nice old man act was starting to look less like charm and more like a deflection. And then, a deputy noticed something. Maybe it was the fresh earth in the garden that didn't match the season. Maybe it was the smell of something burning that wasn't wood. Or maybe it was just the way Rogers stood in his doorway, blocking the view inside, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame. The investigation shifted from a missing person search to a homicide inquiry. The sleepy police force of Fayette County was about to wake up to a nightmare. There is a specific kind of tension that hangs in the air when the law comes for a man who thinks he is above it. It's a psychological chess match. When the Fayette County Sheriff's Department finally decided to move on Fred Rogers, they didn't kick down the door with guns drawn. Not yet. This was 1957. You needed more than a hunch. You needed probable cause. And Rogers, ever the chameleon, was determined not to give them an inch. The sheriff arrived with a warrant to search the premises, but Rogers met him on the porch. He was indignant. He played the victim perfectly. "This is harassment," he claimed. "I am a respectable citizen. How dare you accuse me of harming those lovely ladies?" He used his age as a shield. He pretended to be frail, confused, hurt by the accusations. He invited the officers in, offering them coffee, trying to charm them one last time. "Look around," he said, sweeping his hand across the living room. "Do you see anything sinister here?" And at first glance, they didn't. The living room was tidy. There were doilies on the tables. There was a Bible on the stand. It looked like the home of a lonely, fastidious bachelor. But the officers were no longer buying the act. They noticed that the floorboards in one room seemed newer than the others. They noticed a trunk that was padlocked. They noticed that for a man who claimed his guests had left, there were an awful lot of women's clothes still hanging in the closets. "Why did she leave her winter coat, Fred?" an officer asked. "It's November." "Why would she leave without her coat?" Rogers stuttered. She was in a hurry. She said she'd buy a new one." The mask began to crack. The smooth, confident voice became shrill. The grandfatherly demeanor dissolved into defensiveness. He wasn't the master of the house anymore. He was a cornered animal. The sheriff gave the order. "Tear it apart, boys." Rogers watched in silence as the illusion of his life was dismantled. They pulled books off the shelves, they opened drawers, they looked under the rugs, and then they found the basement door. Basements in Appalachia are common. They are used for storing canned goods, coal and tools. But when the deputy put his hand on the latch of this particular door, he hesitated. There was a smell seeping through the cracks. It wasn't the smell of coal. It wasn't the smell of potatoes. It was a sweet, cloying, metallic scent that triggers a primal alarm in the human brain. The officer looked at Rogers. Rogers wasn't smiling anymore. His face had gone blank. His eyes were dead. He knew the game was over. The officer turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into the darkness. "Flashlight," the officer requested, his voice tight. A beam of light cut through the gloom, dancing over dust motes. It traveled down the stairs, hitting the concrete floor below. The descent into the basement was a descent into the mind of Fred Rogers. The air grew colder with every step. The smell became overpowering, a mix of damp earth, chemical cleaners, and that undeniable scent of decay. The silence was absolute, save for the heavy breathing of the officers and the creak of the wooden stairs. When the flashlight beam finally swept the room, the first thing they noticed was the organization. This wasn't a chaotic dungeon. It was a workshop. Tools were hung neatly on pegboards. Hammers, saws, knives, all arranged by size. Jars of nails and screws were labeled. It looked like the workspace of a meticulous craftsman. But then, the light fell on the details that didn't fit. On a workbench, amidst the tools, sat a woman's purse. Next to it, a pair of glasses. Further down, a single pearl earring. These were not the artifacts of a carpenter. These were trophies. The officers moved deeper into the room. In the corner, there was a pile of what looked like refuse, covered by a tarp. One officer